You know, you people right now are looking at the greatest talent in the wrestling business today.
Christopher Colt, very shrewd individual.
I've often said that Chris Colt was the best wrestler that nobody ever saw.
I love pain. I'm a psychopath. I'm a sadist. I'm a masochist. I do everything.
He was a maniac.
I'll rip your nuts out with my teeth.
A Hell's Angel, a Comanchero, a space oddity, and the original rock and roll wrestler, Chris Colt tore up the territories in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, thrilling audiences with unhinged performances and outlandish characters.
Seat of his trunk, space odyssey, and for all we know, and Colt might well be from outer space.
I'm surprised there were times that Chris didn't get stabbed or shot. That's how good he was as a heel.
A talented performer, Chris Colt's in-ring antics mirrored his volatility outside of the squared circle.
When you looked in his eyes, you thought, my God, this is madman.
Chris was an outlaw. He did just what you didn't want him to do, and he was happier doing it his way.
But beneath his psychedelic appearance, a darkness lurked. And Chris's obsession with death was no act.
Chris had his own Vietnam War going on in his head.
I don't think that it was necessarily white picket fence, 2 kids and a dog or whatever. That's definitely not the life that he lived as a child.
They threw rocks at me, called me queer. Small towns can be so weird and cruel.
Driven by demons and obsessed with death, he became a cult icon and a legend. But who was Chris Colt?
Chris's favorite saying is, hey man, I'm a homosexual, I'm a drug addict, and I'm an alcoholic, and I'll match you scar for scar and you look like a virgin.
I mean, Ozzy Osbourne was Mother Teresa next to Chris Colt. Chris Colt stood out from the average wrestler because he wasn't just a rock star, he was the most wild, over-the-top, strung-out rock star that he could possibly be. I'm Jim Cornette. Before I started my 40-plus year career in professional wrestling, as a kid, I was a fan of Chris Colt. Chris was overboard in every facet of life. He wanted to have the most sex, take the most drugs, do the whatever. One time, he gets booked in a cage match. What's a cage match for? It's to keep the wrestlers in, right? They tell the fans, no way in, no way out, we're gonna settle this. But they didn't count on Chris Colt taking LSD before he got in the cage. So now the match is going on, there's people watching it, everything's normal, and suddenly, Chris Colt, he starts imagining that there are giant spiders coming over the cage to get him. And you've got to think, what in the world would that be like? You're almost naked in spandex in a ring surrounded by a cage with thousands of people looking at you, and suddenly the giant spiders arrive.
And he's just freaking out. And finally he climbs over the cage and he starts punching people, fans. Every fan was like something that needed to be destroyed in his mind.
People, they can't see the spiders. They don't know the spiders are there.
I'm watching the match from upstairs in the balcony. Fans are just on top of him and they're just pummeling him. But he was invincible. Chris didn't feel nothing. He was having bottles broke over his head. He's like, ah, he's like a monster. I came downstairs. I picked up a metal folding chair and I started swinging it at the fans. It just became a riot. My name is Bill Anderson, 30-year veteran of pro wrestling. In the summer of 1975, my rookie year, I became a tag team partner for Crazy Chris Colt as Bill Colt. Cops started arriving, handcuffs going on people. All I smelled was mace. It was in my eyes, and everybody was burning. The world is coming to an end in this arena. And here I am, 18. I drank maybe 2 beers in my entire life. wanting to be a pro wrestler. That's all I cared about. And there's my partner, a bloody mess, drugged out of his mind, beaten up out of his mind. And that's my new partner to start my career. And I'm like, wow, what in the hell am I getting into?
Chris Colt was one of the early guys in the business who was wrapped up in the rock and roll lifestyle. And part of rock and roll, especially in those days, was drugs, chemicals, substances. And when the other wrestlers were, back in the 60s, were, still more old-fashioned, Chris was on the edge of it, and he spent time around Janis Joplin. He worked as a roadie for Joe Cocker.
Because you've been bodyguard to
Joe Cocker.
Joe Cocker.
Twice, and that was fun. So this is the notebook in which Chris Colt started to write what he wanted to become a book. There's about, I think 100 pages or so here of handwritten notes. Chris Colt telling his own story. My name is Ty Haggard, and Chris Colt was my great uncle. As I read through this stuff, especially as a teenager, it was like, holy cow. Like, some of this stuff is wild. Like, I don't know if this is appropriate for a 13-year-old to be reading. But as I read that stuff, I realized that it was his intentions for his story to get out.
I was bored in Phoenix one weekend and decided I wanted to go to San Francisco for the first time, as it was always a dream of mine. All the freedom of the 60s, people getting high, having open sex on bars, streets. It was all open. One night I was walking to Market Street. I noticed a girl sitting on some steps looking lonely, chugging a gallon of wine. I gave her a quick look, said hi, and kept walking. She responded with, "Hey, want to have a drink?" I turned and I said, "Sure." She just smiled. Beyond her smile, I saw sincere, deep eyes, but I also saw tragedy and hurt and pain.
Then, as he's on his way to leave there, he stops at a head shop and sees a poster on the wall and realizes that that's the person that he was talking to, and it was Janis Joplin. And so he went back and asked her, "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" And she just wanted a friend that wasn't there as a beggar or hanger-on or somebody who only liked her because she was talented or something. And he told her, gave her a hug and told her, "Janis, I will always be your friend."
Dad used to run around with her and get hard, and she's a wild woman. What's about a wild little dirty? What's we have it there?
I styled myself as a male Janis Joplin in the ring. Jewelry, chains, clothes, attitude.
She left everything on the stage like he left everything in the ring. She was living in the moment. She didn't care about the future, living fast and dying young. That's the path that he figured he'd take.
Chris told me, if not once, he told me 500 times, I plan on being dead by 27, just like Janis Joplin. And he did everything he could to be there.
Born Charles Fay Harris in Idaho in 1946 and raised in the small town of Drain, Oregon, Chris's chaotic upbringing set the tone for the rest of his life.
Monday through Friday, it was a very loving home. They had everything they wanted and needed. They had clothes, they had money, they had food. It's when they started drinking on the weekends that everything blew up. My grandparents drank a lot, and I've heard stories that on weekends they would stop and get a case of half gallons of whiskey. They would get drunk and have brawls, and the kids were all involved, and it got really brutal. My name's Rhonda Rondo, and I am Chris Colt's niece. My mother was his sister.
Wrestling fans know your uncle as Chris Colt. What do you call him?
Uncle Chuck. He'll always be Uncle Chuck. When he was like 10, he came home from a friend's house. It was a Saturday. Everything was destroyed in the house. All the dishes were broke, and his mom was sitting over on the couch with a bloody face, and there was a gun sitting next to her that Grandpa had hit her in the face with and split the handle of the gun. It was a wooden handle.
I thought she was dead. She was flowing with blood. Blood out of her nose, mouth, ears. We put her in the back seat of the car, a '56 Chevy, trying to hide her. He hadn't had enough of her yet. He was a raving maniac. I screamed, "I wish you were dead, you bastard." He hit me, broke my eardrum. He grabbed another gun and started firing it at us. Sis was now behind the wheel, successfully driving down an old dirt road, making our escape to the highway.
I think by that time, my Uncle Chuck was like, oh my God, I gotta get out of here. Some weekends, there was professional wrestling in the area. My mother and my Uncle Chuck, they would drive to Roseburg, which was the closest big town for him to watch wrestling matches. He just fell in love with it, and that's all he ever wanted to do.
One day in high school, Drain High, we were having an orientation class, and the question came up, what are we going to do with our lives? My turn came, and I said, professional wrestler. The class laughed. It hurt me.
So my uncle went out for the wrestling team in high school, and he made the team. He was really excited about it, and then decided that he needed to stand out a little bit and bleached his hair blonde.
I wanted to look like somebody else, you know, like nobody bleaches their hair in wrestling school. The wrestling team in school, in a little town. I'd done it just to rebel.
They kicked him off the wrestling team, kicked him out of school. He got rocks thrown at him. And so I think that in his mind, he was like, I'm gonna show them. I'm going to make it.
So he jumped on a bus, went out to Chicago, walked into wrestling school and said, hey, I want to do this. Well, that wasn't exactly how it worked. It wasn't just an open invitation. He found himself in a situation where he had to make some money. He met a kid on the street that was prostituting himself. Found that to be intriguing and saw that as a solution for how he could become a professional wrestler.
Now remember, I never had a sex relationship with anyone, but I had heavy bisexual feelings. I was more attracted to men than women. I wanted one thing, to be a professional wrestler. So with nothing to lose, I hit the streets for the first time in my life. I was scared, but it was survival.
He had a chip on his shoulder, and I think that contributed to the by any means necessary type attitude that he took towards it. He was not going to fail. He wanted to come back to his tiny little town of Drain, Oregon as a star.
Finding his way in Chicago, training by day and hustling by night, Charles Harris begins his wrestling career with a variety of ring names. Maurice Chevier, the Magnificent Chevier, and finally, Chris Colt.
Colt magazine was, at the time, one of the early underground gay publications, and that's where he got the name Chris Colt from.
I was to go into the Army in 1966, and I said, Chris, gee, you're going to be drafted pretty soon, too. And he said, no, I'm disqualified. And I said, disqualified? Yeah, I checked out if I like boys. So, c'est la vie. My name is Tom Burke. I'm a wrestling collector and historian. I've been friends with Chris Colt since we were teenagers. It was a different world. It was a different world. And so that was my first contact with a person coming out in that sense.
I don't know that it was a big coming out party. The challenges that must have presented him in the wrestling world at the time that he was doing it.
There were a lot of gay wrestlers that people didn't know were gay, but the promoters did or the boys did, but the fans didn't know. I'm Princess Victoria. I was half of the Women's World Tag Champions for the WWF.
Princess Victoria on the warpath. Another double tomahawk chop.
There was one night and one of the guys came over to me and said, we want you to go over and spend some time with Chris Colt. I said, why? And not punching my own ticket, but he said, if anybody can turn him straight, you can. I guess they thought he was missing something by not being with women, but that wasn't the case for Chris.
One thing I noticed when we were traveling together, and he would talk about the other boys in the circuit, and always had this image in his mind that they were backstabbing him and out to get him.
Any territory he was in and out, he'd either have a personal issue or just something would happen, and he'd be gone. The only place that he stayed for any significant portion of his career was the small territory in Arizona.
In Arizona, Chris teams with wrestler Ron Dupree and takes the ring name Paul Dupree, tag teaming as the Dupree brothers. It's a formative relationship in Chris's life, professionally and personally.
Ron Dupree was my Uncle Chuck's very best friend. They were like very close. I only got to be with him a couple times in life, but he was a very, very nice, kind guy.
They were a couple. You know, Ron was older, probably by about maybe 8 years, maybe 10. Their love for the business kind of gelled them together.
Chris and Ronnie became lovers. You know, I just never asked a lot of questions along the way, but it was something I understood to be the way it was.
I can't imagine it would have been easy to be gay, period, in wrestling in the 50s or 60s, much less to be a gay couple. It was not something that was easily accepted, and it wasn't information that was offered freely. So in a lot of cases, a promoter or a booker or the wrestlers in a particular territory might not even know, and through a number of different gimmicks, they kind of changed their looks and changed their presentation, but they were always together.
Weighing in at a combined weight of 450 pounds, the World Tag Team Champions, the California Hells Angels.
The California Hells Angels were a chance for them to have a gimmick as a team and sort of bring real life into the thing. The metal, the studs, the iron cross, the leather. Well, they sell all that stuff in the Village in New York City. They were so far ahead of their time, nobody even knew what the it was. They said, okay, they're bikers. No, they're gay. Same tailor.
Pushing the limits of what's acceptable to audiences of the era, Chris is determined to become the ultimate villain.
Chris was so excited on TV once, and Chris knew how to generate heat.
In those days in wrestling, trying to push the envelope either meant you could draw money because people would be shocked and surprised, or you could go too far and get heat and the whole company could go under in the twinkling of an eye because you thought it would fly, but it wouldn't.
Chris was not an anti-American by any means, but he took an American flag and with a lighter and lit it on fire and burned it up.
They went too far and they got kicked off the television for it. Not the wrestlers, the actual wrestling program got taken off the air. Even in a small territory in Arizona, even 50 years ago, even back in those days on a local television show, even if you were heel wrestlers, it was going a little too far to burn the American flag on television. Didn't fly.
Chris's time in Arizona comes to an abrupt end when his lover, Ron Dupree, suffers a heart attack. Though Ron can no longer wrestle, the two continue their relationship outside of the ring. As Chris searches for a new tag team partner, he ends up in a trio with Bill Anderson and Mike Boyette.
Chris had approached me and he says, I got a proposition for you, and not that proposition, a different proposition. He says, I'd like to have you be Bill Colt, my younger brother.
When they came to Tennessee, the team was supposed to be Chris Colt and Mike Boyette with valet Bill Colt.
William Colt, the valet, preceding his brother, and he almost got run over.
Colt changed outfits, he changed gimmicks because he was so wrapped up in the rock and roll lifestyle, the makeup, the hair he already had, the personal habits he already had. He wanted to create his gimmick being that he is a rock star. Bill at the time, he has no body weight whatsoever. He just started. So he's a lost ball in high weeds. And if you were gonna say, okay, who is the professional wrestler that is using the most mind-altering substances? If you weren't pointing at Chris Colt, you'd be pointing at Mike Boyette. So this team was destined for disaster to begin with.
One night we left Johnson City. I'm driving, Mike Boyette's in the passenger seat, Chris is in the back seat. He's getting high just like he wants, to live in the Janis Joplin, Joe Cocker life. And all of a sudden, I feel a punch to the side of my head. And I was like looking in the mirror, like, what are you doing? He says, you. And then he reached up with his right hand and grabbed Mike's hair and yanked it and pulled him back. Then Chris reached up with his other hand and grabbed my hair and he's pulling me. And Mike just said, stop the car. Stop the car. What I learned, Mike is nobody to F with. He was a Vietnam veteran. He was a world judo champion. He was a very tough, legitimate guy. So we pull over, Chris gets out of the car, walks around to my side, boom, as hard as he could, punches me in the face. Then he walked back over to Boyette, did the same thing. Mike says, this is your warning, one more time and I'll kill you. Chris went to swing, Mike blocked him, hooked him in a front face lock and just cinched on it. And Chris just went limp. Mike just dropped him. Chris was laying right beside the car. Mike gets in the passenger seat. He says, back up. And I said, what do you mean back up? He says, just back up. So I start slowly backing. I get about 1/8 of the mile down the road, and Mike grabs the wheel, puts his foot on top of my foot on the accelerator on the gas, and he says, I'm killing this mother right now.
Chris Colt's erratic and violent behavior comes to a head as he's tossed onto a highway and stares down a car speeding in his direction.
Mike says, we're putting an end to this shit. It's never gonna happen again, ever. It's the headlights getting brighter and brighter and brighter and brighter on Chris's body. And at the last second, I hit Mike's arm just to the side and I turn the wheel. I says, Mike, we can't kill this guy. We can't kill him. We can't do this. And Mike says, that mother deserved to die. He says, leave him, leave him. I honestly did not really overanalyze the story in my mind until many years later that I could have been in prison the rest of my life for murder. The cops could have easily arrested me and said, you purposely ran this guy over, first-degree murder. Could have been death. Easily.
Bill Anderson and Mike Boyette leave Chris for dead on the side of the Southern Road. But the next day, when Bill makes his way home to his Nashville apartment, a surprise is waiting for him.
Open the apartment door, look in, and Chris is sitting at our dining room table, and he's just big smile comes on his face. Come on in, sit down, sit down, sit down, sit down. And I'm like, looking at Chris, never saying a word, like, oh, I'm back to being a brother, maybe a friend again. I don't know what's going on. He says, we're getting rid of Boyette. And that was the end of Boyette. We were leaving Tennessee as a tag team, going to wrestle in Seattle. Before I could even get off the plane, Chris was already off the plane and sitting in a bar. Remember it just like yesterday. Remember him sitting there with a drink in front of him? And that's my last visual of Chris. And I hadn't made up my mind exactly what to do until right then. And I said, this is it. I can't do this anymore. And I just walked away.
Not long after his partnership with Bill Anderson ends, Chris's attempt to get his career restarted is stopped when he suffers an unimaginable tragedy.
It was in Washington State at a small show that Ron Dupree had ring announced at, and he had a heart attack at ringside in front of all the people. They called an ambulance. Chris rode with Ron in the ambulance to the hospital, and Ron died on the way, right in front of Chris. He witnessed the whole thing.
He had loved Ronnie all his life. That was the only time that I ever heard him come out and say anything of emotion of that way. Chris was holding his hand. Chris told me that he just wept and wept. I don't think Chris ever overcame the death of Ron Dupree.
He was devastated because they were so close. You know, he didn't know how to go on without him. My uncle was like, I don't know what I'm going to do.
Well, they'd been together at that point for over 10 years, not only professionally, but personally. That was a big turning point for Chris because he kind of lost an anchor that he had, that to somebody to keep him tethered to some element of reality.
After losing my lover of 6 years, I hit bottom, I thought. The bottom under the bottom came later. More dope was yet to come. More fixes were to be made. More hearts were to be broken. Mainly mine.
And he just metamorphosized himself to fit whatever mood he was in at the time. This is where he decides he's not just going to be called Chris Colt. Now he's the Chris Colt Experience.
The Chris Colt Experience. Your referee, Joe Golub. Welcome to my breakdown.
And he uses Alice Cooper's Welcome to My Nightmare as his entrance music. What he did in that period of time was invent modern entrance music in wrestling. He saw the tie-in that it could have with the fans to set a tone. Definitely a pitch black, dark, psychedelic edge to it because that's where he was in his mind space.
I will not be responsible for hurting, crippling, or putting anybody in the hospital that I wrestle up against right now, man.
He'd make you hate him. My name's Edward Juvenetti. I wrestled for 35 years as Moondog Ed Moretti.
From Idaho, Moondog Moretti.
Back then, you didn't have people like that. He would shock people, he would scare people. He's bizarrety at its best. He was so bizarre, he got banned in England from wrestling on TV. They called him the vampire. They couldn't take how he was. He was just too bizarre. He scared people, and he was just being Chris.
When you look at the picture of Chris in his younger years, he's a good-looking guy. As years progressed and he got into his demonic possession image, where he would put needles and stuff in his face, just totally strange. It was like out of a horror movie.
You know, the whole vibe of Welcome to My Nightmare, he was living it. Chris's life from that point didn't get better, definitely got more out of control.
Throughout the mid-1980s, Chris's erratic behavior and appetite for drugs are both wildly out of control.
And another disappointing loss for Chris Colt.
Into the 80s, if he popped up here,
It's gonna be a fight!
my God, he might look like he hasn't seen the sun in 10 years. Or if he pops up over here, now he's got more hair and he's got a mustache and a beard and he's gained some weight and he looks like he might have once been out in the sun. And over here, he's barely able to stand up straight.
And promoters kind of got tired of, you know, is Chris going to show up, or, you know, and if he does, what shape is he going to be in?
From Germany, 220.
Several years later, he's in Alabama as Chris Von Colt, and he's a Nazi. He just said, well, what is the most offensive thing that I can do to the general public? I'll become Chris Von Colt, and I'll be a Nazi. Nazis were big in wrestling in the 50s and 60s to get all the heat because they were heels. It was after World War II. When you get to 1987, he just wanted to be a Nazi, just to piss people off.
I think it was desperation, maybe, trying to find heat, you know. His reputation was getting tarnished left and right. Probably because, you know, at that time, I think he was getting too absorbed into drugs.
Chris Colt started doing cocaine. And I think that was the beginning of the turning point. Then from there, it switched to crystal meth. I think that's where it got really dark, and that's where the desperation came in.
By the late 1980s, Chris Colt's wrestling career dries up, due in part to his mounting substance abuse issues. After alienating most of his friends and allies, he fades into obscurity.
He was done wrestling. He has no income. And so he gets this idea that he'll start busting drug houses.
I would go on 6 and 7 days up. By the way, now I'm addicted to crystal meth. Speed. Not like the cocaine a few years ago. I'm clean from coke. I just switched drugs, a more dangerous one where you require no sleep, no food. I'm in a dope house in Hollywood in the Silver Lake area, one of the biggest dope houses around. It took me 4 buys just to get in. I walk in, confident, and place my order for an 8-ball. As soon as the dealer shows me, I flash my badge so fast they don't check it and say, "You're all under arrest. I work for LAPD undercover." I tell them the house is surrounded by police cars. I catch them off guard, take the dope, and run.
You'd always hear a different story. If you ask somebody, "Hey, have you heard anything about Chris Colt?" And they're like, yeah, he's in Portland or he's in Seattle, but they never knew anything definitive.
That's what kind of said about this mystique about Chris Colt today with the modern generation, because he has a 20-year career with the most amazing ups and downs and all kinds of outlandish behavior, and then disappears off the face of the earth. But, I mean, you could have said, oh, he's become an international double-naught spy or an astronaut. It would have been equally as believable, because his whole life was insane. And nobody in wrestling knew where Chris Colt had gone until somebody saw an adult movie.
With him as a gay man who, at least in his work, always kind of had to keep that under wraps. He was attempting to show the world that side of himself. This is not something that I see as shameful. This is who I am.
I have not seen any of his productions, but I understand that, again, he was over the top with everything. Whether it's wrestling, I got to take all the bumps and cause all the riots, or with sex, I got to have as much of it with as many people as possible, and I don't care who and what and who's watching.
I did not hear about him doing those videos until very late in life. I Googled his name, and what I saw was like, oh my God, that is not my uncle. That was very secretive. I had no idea that he had done any of that.
Now I'm back. I'm back, and I'm in shape, and I'm ready to fight, and I'll run you right out of town, and then I'll you.
After disappearing from the wrestling scene in the mid-'80s, Chris Colt resurrects himself as an adult film star.
You're with a professional wrestler.
Shocking many from his past.
Chris was a dream to work with. I sat him down in front of the camera, and as soon as I turned the camera on and yelled action, Charles Harris turned into Chris Colt. The same way that Norma Jean Baker turned into Marilyn Monroe. I'm Jack Fritcher. I've been a writer and a university professor teaching film and literature and pop culture, the editor of Drummer magazine, and I've written 20 books and shot 150 videos. Well, Chris had been reading my writing in Drummer for years, and he liked my Palm Drive Video movies because Palm Drive Video's tagline was masculine videos for men who like men masculine. In 1987, Drummer had a cover featuring the Barbarian Brothers. They were actors and bodybuilders, but their gimmick was acting like pro wrestlers. And shortly thereafter that, Chris contacted me about shooting a video, and we set it all up that he came here and stayed for a week.
How old were you You were 17 when you started. What year was that?
1921.
1921. 64. During the San Francisco
I was 4 years old then.
Facelifts, you know, they still
Palm Drive Video was like the USO entertaining the American troops during the war. Palm Drive entertained gay men during the 1980s. We specialized in solo videos, that is one actor talking to the viewer through the camera lens. Chris Colt's heat was in his person, in his face, and the way he related directly to the camera.
Yeah, I'm the street fighter. I'm the original rock and roll wrestler, the original Hell's Angel of wrestling.
Chris knew also that I was not going to give him a script. He could let it all hang out and be as crude and honest and open and vulgar even as he wanted to be.
You want a wrestler, Dick? A real man, a professional wrestler, Dick? I am the king of wrestling.
He said one of the greatest powers he ever felt in his life was walking into a ring and making 10,000 fans scream. The way he made 10,000 fans scream, he put that energy into the camera to make the viewer come.
Most people don't bring this amount of energy to the screen right away. You have to build them up to it. But he hit the set running. I mean, this is not fake, this is real.
That's you in the mask.
That's me in the mask, yes. I shall have these moments to remember.
Chris was trying to create a statement about his triumph in wrestling, in his wrestling career as a homo-masculine man.
Another victory. One more time somebody goes down, and they're gonna go down on me.
Pro wrestling has always been softcore porn for gay men. And Chris knew that as a wrestler, he himself was a fetish object.
I ran Hulk Hogan out of New York City. He was scared to sign a match with me because I'd take his belt and slap his ass with it.
Hulk Hogan was a god to the gay community. When Hulk would play with the WWF at the Cow Palace would be, filled with gay men there yelling the Hulkster on. Because to them, he was a strong, powerful, well-built, healthy-looking man.
That is 24 inches. That is incredible. That's awesome, I'll tell you.
And they were strong, powerful men themselves, but they were afraid that they were going to shrink away because AIDS is known as the wasting disease.
Did Chris himself, was he infected?
I don't know if he was infected. I presume that all my models in the 80s were infected because you didn't ask and they didn't tell. And I made sure that everything on set was very sterile and sanitized. And there was no discussion of that. He looked perfectly healthy, but somebody with AIDS can look perfectly healthy.
And Chris is writing a book about wrestling, The Inside Story, and I'm going to help him with it on the final version.
That's going to be in there.
You write the whole thing.
Chris came to me because he knew he needed a different kind of publicity and coverage for this last part of his career. In a sense, movies are like a gladiator entering the Colosseum for his last match. Hail and farewell. We who are about to die salute you.
That was really dirty.
Yeah, go ahead.
He had hoped to have an extra act by being a trainer and a coach, but that never happened.
Almost 10 years after his wrestling career was over, Chris Colt's wild and chaotic life quietly comes to an end.
So many stories of how he passed away. What is your understanding of how Chris passed away?
He was found in a back alley in Seattle. I'm sure of that. Sure of that part. How and what the circumstances were in regards to how he ended up there, I'm not sure.
I had heard through the grapevine that he was found in a chair with a needle in his arm when he died, when they found him dead. And he had been dead for like about 2 or 3 days.
Shortly after he died, I got a phone call from somebody asking me if I knew anything about his death, and I said no, and they told me that they thought that he had died of AIDS in some kind of flop house in Seattle.
He died the way he wanted to die. That was Chris. And it was probably on the streets. He didn't want to live in this world any other way.
I don't think it was peaceful. I can tell you that. He's not the type of guy who was ever not at full tilt. And I would believe that he died in that same vein.
The official death certificate for Charles Fay Harris, dated May 23, 1995, lists HIV as a factor in his death. No autopsy is performed. His listed occupation? Professional wrestler.
Been a lot of years to try to make it here. That's why this means so much. He lived his life the way he wanted to live it. He lived a rock star lifestyle, and that's the way he would have wanted it. I mean, if he would do it over again, he would have done it the same way. He died too young, although it's what he wanted, honestly. If he had it his way, it would have been 27, but at 49, his body succumbed, and I can only just say I'm really sorry that he's gone, and I wish he was here.
He was the first at so many things, and he was so good at what he did, the way that he could work, the way that he could bump, the way that he could get heat from the crowd, the way that he could talk on promos. He was decades ahead of his time, and his talents would be in the upper 20% of anybody in the business today.
Chris was just outstanding. He was ahead of his time. I think Chris was one of the true icons of wrestling, a person who changed the focus of wrestling and brought rock and roll into wrestling far earlier than Cyndi Lauper, Hulk Hogan, etc.
He was doing things like coming off of the top rope with an elbow before a lot of other people were.
If Chris was not on drugs and alcohol, Chris would have been one of the greatest.
If you reduce people to one word, you miss the entire world of what they are really about. And so reducing Chris to a drug addict, an alcoholic, a faggot, does not come anywhere near to the inner truth of what that man was about. And I think a lot of his addictions to alcohol and drugs grew out of the homophobia that he experienced in the world and in wrestling.
He's a complete human being. You can go to online forums that talk about pro wrestling, and they'll talk about the character that was Chris Colt. This is a real human being with his own demons and family and people that he loved.
He was a really, really good uncle. You know, he would always bring us something when he would come to visit. Sometimes it might have just been a roll of toilet paper from a motel, but we were happy to get it from him because he was our uncle.
The last letter I got from him was 1991. I stopped drinking and drugging. I'm clean and sober, the way I should have been. And from now on, Chris Coe is buried. Chuck Harris lives. Want to talk to you soon. And he signs off, write well, keep well, your buddy, the legendary Chris Coe, AKA Chuck Harris. Such is life.
The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels had debuted the structure months prior in about widely considered a masterpiece. Foley, studying the tape of that inaugural match, realized he lacked the athletic agility of Shawn Michaels. In search of a solution, he consulted his mentor, Terry Funk. According to accounts of the conversation, Funk jokingly suggested starting the match on top of the cage and getting thrown off. While Funk laughed, Foley took it as a legitimate blueprint. He pitched the idea to McMahon and The Undertaker. They were heavily resistant. Foley, a man who freely admits he is terrified of heights, managed to manipulate the conversation, assuring them he had been on top of the cage before and felt completely comfortable. It was a bluff that would change wrestling history. On the night of the event, inside the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, 16,000 fans watched in utter confusion as Mankind bypassed the cage door and began scaling the massive structure. The first fall. The match officially began some 20 feet above the concrete. The structural integrity of the cell was immediately compromised, designed only with zip ties. The mesh paneling began to give way under the combined 600 pounds of the two athletes. As they brawled near the edge, the commentators at ringside, including myself, grew highly anxious. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. The Spanish announce table below looked like a fragile dollhouse. Then it happened. The Undertaker grabbed Mankind and hurled him off the edge of the roof. A 300-pound man plummeted 20 feet through the air, crashing violently through the Spanish announce desk. The sound of the impact echoed through the arena like a horrific automobile collision. Backstage, producers, writers, and fellow wrestlers exploded in sheer panic. Many legitimately believed they had just watched a man die on live television. According to medical personnel, including Dr. Francois Petit, the impact was catastrophic. Foley landed terribly on his back, aggravating a dislocated shoulder. Emergency medical technicians rushed to ringside with a gurney. It seemed the match was mercifully over. But as the gurney rolled up the aisle, the unimaginable occurred. Foley rolled off the stretcher, a bloodied, broken man, and began walking back toward the cage. The unplanned catastrophe. Foley climbed the structure a second time. What followed was an event even Foley had not anticipated. The planned sequence called for The Undertaker to choke slam Mankind onto the mesh roof, theoretically causing the cage to slowly sag for a visual effect. Instead, the zip ties completely failed. Mankind plummeted straight through the roof, falling another 15 to 20 feet, this time slamming back first onto the wooden ring canvas, which is essentially unyielding concrete. Compounding the trauma, a heavy steel folding chair fell through the opening, striking Foley directly in the face upon impact. This was not a scripted angle. Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious. Panic consumed the ring as Terry Funk and Dr. Petit scrambled into the cage. For 42 terrifying seconds, Foley was completely unresponsive. According to referee Jimmy Corderas, The Undertaker stared down from the broken roof, instructing those in the ring to check if his opponent was even alive. When Foley finally regained consciousness, his first instinct was not survival, but the show. Through the fog of severe brain injury, he pushed his tongue through a massive, bleeding hole beneath his lower lip to create a memorable television image. A tooth, dislodged by the falling chair, had somehow been inhaled and was visibly lodged in his nostril. The match continued. Barely able to stand, Foley insisted on finishing the bout, introducing thousands of metal thumbtacks into the ring before finally being mercifully pinned by The Undertaker. After 17 brutal minutes, the spectacle was over. Act 4, the price of the spotlight. The immediate aftermath resembled a trauma ward. Behind the curtain, Mr. McMahon approached Foley, thanked him for his sacrifice, but firmly demanded he never attempt anything like it again. Foley's wife, Colette, who had been watching from home with their young children, was furious and terrified, screaming over the phone that his children believed he was dead. The official medical reports cataloged a horrifying list of injuries. A severe, undocumented concussion, 15 stitches underneath the lower lip, 2 missing teeth, a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a bruised kidney that plagued him for 6 weeks. Yet, despite the corporate warnings, the bar had been raised, and Foley felt intense, undeniable pressure to maintain his status as a hardcore legend. Just 7 months later, Foley engaged in another deeply controversial bout, an I Quit match against The Rock. Ignoring the pleas of producers, Foley instructed his opponent to strike him with a steel chair without holding back. The script called for a handful of strikes. Instead, while his hands were cupped behind his back, Foley absorbed 11 unprotected chair shots directly to his skull. His young daughter, Noelle, watched in the front row in tears. A moment captured on film that remains incredibly difficult to watch, according to medical experts. Taking that level of impact is akin to enduring multiple 25-mile-per-hour car crashes. It was a horrific sequence that blurred the line between entertainment and legitimate assault, causing irreversible brain trauma for the sake of a television storyline. Epilogue: The Echoes of the Cell. Today, the long-term effects of chronic traumatic encephalopathy loom over the wrestling industry like a dark cloud. Neurologists independent of World Wrestling Entertainment flatly told Foley he should never wrestle again. The consequences of concussion upon concussion have manifested in memory issues, chronic pain, and an uncertain future. Foley's family admits they live in constant fear of what his neurological health will look like in 10 or 20 years. To combat the decline, Foley relies on spoken word tours, utilizing the stage as mental gymnastics to keep his brain sharp and to continue feeling the roar of the crowd he has chased his entire life. For years, Foley harbored deep resentment that his entire, multifaceted career was overshadowed by the singular madness of Hell in a Cell. It took time and a quiet conversation with The Undertaker to realize that what they built that night in Pittsburgh will outlive them both. When Foley recently stood in a World Wrestling Entertainment warehouse and placed his hand on the rusted steel of that original cell, the man who spent a lifetime absorbing pain finally broke down in tears. Professional wrestling is a world where men and women engage in a surreal, sublime form of performance art, sacrificing their bodies to the acceptance of total strangers. Mick Foley gave his blood, his teeth, and parts of his mind to that canvas. It was a dangerously magical way to make a living. But as we review the medical files, the terrified faces of his family, and the brutal reality of the footage, we are left looking into the abyss, wondering if any reward on earth is truly worth that kind of risk. The Shadow of the Cell, a descent into wrestling's darkest masterpiece. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a profound look into a night that forever altered the landscape of professional wrestling. I have sat at ringside for decades. I have called the action for the greatest spectacles in sports entertainment. But there are certain nights that do not just stay in your memory, they scar your psyche. On June 28, 1998, at the World Wrestling Federation King of the Ring Premium event, we witnessed a spectacle that defied logic, defied safety, and, quite frankly, defied human endurance. The Undertaker versus Mankind, Hell in a Cell. According to the records, the footage, and the testimonies of those who lived it, this match hits you like a mallet to the consciousness. Going into the broadcast, everyone knew the concept of the cell was dangerous. But no one, not the executives, not the production crew, and certainly not the fans in attendance, knew it was going to be that dangerous. We had two incredible talents out there who liked to push the envelope until it plummeted right over the edge. As the old industry adage goes, the storylines might be scripted, but you absolutely cannot fake gravity. I have been frightened by a multitude of things in the professional wrestling industry over my career. Yet, nothing frightened me as much as the events of that evening. Until, of course, the match progressed into its darkest chapters. What left fans across the globe completely stunned was the unrelenting, horrifying punishment that Mick Foley, the man behind the Mankind mask, endured until you watched it unfold before your very eyes. You simply did not believe that a human being could physically sustain that level of trauma and live to tell the tale. This match was real. The pain was real. The drama was terrifyingly real. Watching from the monitors, industry veterans were cursing, screaming, and questioning Foley's sanity. The question echoed to the locker room and the arenas. Why are you doing this? Today, Hell in a Cell persists as one of wrestling's most infamous matches. Its legacy is a double-edged sword, an epic, undeniable success of sports entertainment, but equally a grim cautionary tale. According to those backstage, the industry dodged multiple fatal bullets that day. It remains a dangerously crazy masterpiece. But as we peel back the layers of this investigation, we all need to ask ourselves one fundamental question. Was it worth it? The psychology of a hardcore legend. To understand the madness of June 28th, 1998, we first have to understand the mind of Mick Foley. According to psychological profiles and his own admissions, everyone who enters a wrestling business is searching for something they find missing in their own personal lives. For Foley, the drive was rooted in a profound, overwhelming need for acceptance. He was teased heavily in his youth, breeding an intense desire to be liked, to be noticed, and, eventually, to capture that World Wrestling Federation championship. The origins of Sacrifice, Foley's dedication to eliciting a reaction, started early. During his sophomore year of college, Foley once took a swig of red food coloring and executed a flying leap off a bed, crashing onto a concrete floor. When he hit the concrete, he spat the fake blood into the air. The revelation, as the dorm students watched in shock. One girl screamed that it was the most disgusting thing she had ever seen. In that moment, Foley felt immense power. His internal philosophy was cemented. If he could not make people love him conventionally, he would compel them by disgusting and shocking them. He needed reactions. This philosophy birthed the persona of Cactus Jack, a wild, seemingly unhinged brawler. To the audience, he appeared legitimately insane. But underneath the madness was a calculated, charismatic performer. Jim Ross, the vice president of talent relations at the time, noted that Foley was a master of ring psychology. He understood that fans gravitated toward unpredictability. By going off script, by biting his opponents, by leaning into the chaos, Foley forced a spotlight onto himself. Foley did not just stumble into extreme wrestling. His foundation was built in the grueling circuits of Japan. While living in a sparse bedroom with nothing but a mattress on the floor and an old video cassette recorder, he would study Japanese deathmatch for up to 12 hours a day. He was captivated by the realism, the concept that a wrestler was not just fighting another man, but fighting the brutal environment itself. Guided by legendary brawler Terry Funk, who became his mentor, Foley engaged in explosive, bloody, violent matches involving barbed wire and composition for explosives. Foley was always drawn to the extreme. He believed that bleeding and enduring agony on his hands and knees was undeniable proof that he had created something special. The reluctant arrival and the birth of Mankind. Despite his international underground fame, Foley never saw himself as a fit for the World Wrestling Federation. At that time, the company was operating in the general audience's rated era, very clean, very traditional, and highly commercialized. Foley's brutal style directly clashed with the corporate image. In fact, World Wrestling Federation Chairman Vince McMahon actively did not want Mick Foley. According to executive producers, McMahon did not find Foley marketable or physically attractive. It took immense convincing from Jim Ross, who pleaded with McMahon to trust his eye for talent. The company desperately needed fresh, unpredictable opponents for their top attraction, The Undertaker. McMahon was tired of relying on slow, towering giants. They needed a lunatic. McMahon finally relented with a strict caveat. He would hire Foley, but he demanded Foley's face be covered. According to Hall of Famer Gerald Briscoe, the creative team was tasked with building a character out of absolutely nothing. Thus, Mankind was born, a tortured, masked soul. It was a bizarre, high-risk gimmick that would fail miserably with any other athlete. But Foley possessed a unique ability to connect with the audience. His willingness to try anything, his absolute commitment to the character, made it work. He became the perfect dance partner for The Undertaker. They battled across the globe, laying a foundation of legendary matches. However, by the summer of 1998, the Mankind character had plateaued. Foley knew he needed a monumental moment to revitalize his career. The conception of Hell in a Cell. The stage was set for the King of the Ring premium event. The company wanted to reignite the Mankind versus Undertaker rivalry using a relatively new, terrifying concept. Hell in a Cell. Unlike traditional cage matches where victory was achieved by climbing out or walking through a door, the cell had a roof. It was designed as an inescapable prison. The first iteration of this match featured The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, and it was a technical masterpiece. Foley, by his own admission, watched that first match open-jawed, knowing he did not possess the athletic agility of Shawn Michaels. Foley needed an equalizer. He sought advice from his mentor, Terry Funk. During their brainstorming session, Funk laughingly suggested a ridiculous concept. What if you started a match on the roof of the cage, and what if you were thrown off? Funk meant it as a dark joke. Foley saw it as a salvation. He pitched the idea to Vince McMahon and The Undertaker. Initially, The Undertaker was entirely against throwing his opponent off the structure, but Foley was dead set, successfully selling the idea to the booking committee. He was not looking at this match as the second act of his career. He was merely trying to keep his head above water, believing this might be his final run in the industry. The fall that stopped the world. As the match approached, the tension backstage was palpable. Referees and producers, including Jimmy Corderas and Gerald Briscoe, were glued to their monitors. When Foley's music hit, he did not enter the cage. He began to climb it. The shock rippled through the 16,000 people inside the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. The commentators were entirely in the dark. As Foley reached the top of the dark, imposing structure, he realized a horrifying truth. He was terrified of heights. When The Undertaker followed him to the roof, disaster immediately loomed. The top section of the cage was secured only by zip ties. With 600 pounds of human weight shifting on the mesh, the structure began to give way. The mesh sank by a foot. The terrifying sound of zip ties snapping echoed through the arena. The original plan was for Foley to execute a suplex on the roof, but The Undertaker wisely cut the sequence short. Realizing the roof was on the verge of total collapse, they brawled toward the edge. From the broadcast booth, the commentators watched in disbelief as the two titans neared the precipice. Then it happened. From nearly 20 feet in the air, a 300-pound man was violently flung off the roof. He plummeted toward the Spanish announce table. According to Foley, the fall felt like slow motion, yet it was over in the blink of an eye. The sound of the impact was sickening. It was a terrifying crash that sounded like a severe automobile accident. Backstage, the locker room erupted in sheer panic. The Spanish commentator, Hugo Savanovic, barely bailed out of his chair in time to avoid being crushed. The audience gasped in collective horror. Mothers covered their children's eyes, whispering that it was fake, desperately trying to soothe them, even as they themselves panicked. Foley had survived the impact solely because he possessed the spatial awareness to rotate his body midair, landing flat to distribute the force. Medical personnel, including Dr. Francois Petit, a highly skilled ringside physician, rushed the area. Emergency medical technicians struggled to get a gurney to the wreckage. Foley was loaded onto the stretcher. His shoulder was dislocated. Everyone, from the executives to the fans, believed the match was officially over. The second act, pushing past the point of no return. But the human will, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to entertain, is a terrifying force. As the gurney was being wheeled up the aisle, Foley realized the audience was completely mesmerized. Against the frantic pleas of officials and doctors screaming for him to stop, Foley rolled off the stretcher. He smiled a broken smile, and he began to climb the cell again. This decision elevated Foley from a great performer to an immortal legend, but it also set the stage for genuine disaster. The next sequence was supposed to be simple, a choke slam on the roof, causing the mesh to sag dramatically for a visual effect. But the integrity of the cell had been compromised. When The Undertaker delivered the choke slam, the mesh completely gave way. Foley plummeted through the roof, crashing violently onto the unforgiving ring mat, a surface that is essentially concrete covered by a thin layer of padding. This fall was completely unplanned. It was vastly more dangerous than the first. To make matters worse, a heavy steel folding chair fell through the broken roof, striking Foley directly in the face upon impact. The impact, Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious. This was the first time in his legendary career that he was out cold. The damage, he lay completely motionless. His teeth were knocked out. One of his teeth had actually been dislodged and, due to his heavy breathing, was sucked into his nasal passage. The panic. Backstage, Vince McMahon desperately tried to reach the production truck. Foley's wife, Colette, watching from home, was furious, believing her husband had betrayed her trust by hiding this stunt. Terry Funk and Dr. Francois Petit flooded the ring. The Undertaker stared down to the hole in the roof, visibly shaken, instructing Funk to check if Foley was even alive. Funk reported back that Foley was breathing, but there was no one home in his eyes. For 42 seconds, Mick Foley was completely separated from his consciousness. In a modern era, the medical team would have immediately halted the broadcast. But in that era, matches were not stopped. Time was bought. Terry Funk brilliantly initiated a physical altercation with The Undertaker to draw the camera's focus away from the medical emergency. Incredibly, Foley regained consciousness. His first instinct was not survival, but television. Realizing he had a massive puncture wound below his lip, he purposely stuck his tongue to the hole to create a gruesome, unforgettable visual. He then demanded the match continue, insisting on a sequence involving thousands of steel thumbtacks. Foley purposely rolled through the tacks, ensuring his body was covered in them, pushing his physical limits so far that the pain became white noise. Finally, after 17 agonizing minutes, The Undertaker secured the victory. The aftermath and the cost of immortality. When Foley returned backstage, his body resembled a war zone. Vince McMahon approached him, thanked him for his immense sacrifice to the company, but sternly demanded that Foley never do anything like that ever again. Foley had a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a bruised kidney that lasted for 6 weeks, 15 stitches in his lip, and a severe concussion. Yet, the match was an undeniable triumph. It revolutionized his career. Within 6 months, the man McMahon initially deemed unmarketable was crowned the World Wrestling Federation champion. But success in this industry demands constant escalation. The bar had been raised, and Foley felt obligated to consistently over-deliver. Just 7 months later, Foley engaged in an I Quit match against The Rock. Despite warnings from executives like Jim Ross, Foley orchestrated a sequence involving unprotected steel chair shots to the head. The plan was for 5 shots. The reality was 11 brutal, undefended strikes to the skull. The footage of Foley's wife and young children sobbing in the front row remains one of the most difficult segments to watch in sports documentary history. Foley's daughter, Noelle, admits she has no memory of her father wrestling, likely due to psychological trauma. The fiction of the storyline had resulted in factual brain damage, the long shadow of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The collateral damage of Foley's legendary career is a sobering reality check for the entire professional wrestling industry. Today, the medical community understands the devastating long-term effects of concussions. Taking a severe fall in a ring is likened to experiencing a 25-mile-per-hour automobile collision. Foley endured concussion upon concussion. Independent neurologists warned him that he should never wrestle again, predicting severe neurological decline. Foley now lives under the terrifying shadow of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. There are days when he struggles with memory, times he has driven around his neighborhood, unable to remember where he lives. His family worries constantly about what his cognitive state will be in 10 or 20 years. To combat the decline, Foley continuously engages his mind. He performs spoken word tours, utilizing the stage as mental gymnastics, fighting the fading light by remaining active and stimulated by the fans' adoration. Conclusion: was the canvas worth the blood? When we analyze the career of Mick Foley, we are forced to confront the dark side of sports entertainment. We watch athletes dress in wild costumes and engage in a fantasy form of combat that leaves them physically shattered, all to earn the fleeting acceptance of total strangers. For Foley, it was always about the roar of the crowd. He admits that he cannot call his need for approval a flaw, without acknowledging that it is the exact catalyst for his immense success. For years, Foley harbored resentment toward the Hell in a Cell match, feeling trapped by its shadow, believing it was the only thing he was remembered for, but time and perspective have offered him peace. A poignant conversation with The Undertaker reminded him that what they created that night will outlive them both. During a visit to the World Wrestling Entertainment warehouse, Foley found himself standing before the original cell. He reached out, touched the rusted steel, and began to weep. It was a profound realization of his own mortality. He realized how lucky he was to simply be alive. There is no financial reward big enough to justify the risks taken on June 28, 1998. The industry lacked the medical knowledge regarding head trauma that we possess today. Yet, Foley himself cannot say with absolute certainty that he would have changed his path. The world offered him a violent canvas, and he used his own body to create a surreal, sublime, and highly dangerous form of performance art. It was a magical, harrowing way to make a living, but as the roar of the crowd fades and the physical toll mounts, the story of Hell in a Cell remains wrestling's ultimate paradox. A breathtaking masterpiece painted with undeniable, irreversible sacrifice. The Descent into Hell, a cautionary masterpiece. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Whenever we talk about the history of professional wrestling, we inevitably find ourselves drawn to the spectacular, the unbelievable, and sometimes the profoundly disturbing in the annals of sports entertainment. There is one night that forever altered the landscape of the industry. It was June 28, 1998, at the World Wrestling Federation King of the Ring pay-per-view. On this night, a match took place that would instantly earn its spot as one of the most shocking spectacles ever broadcast. The Undertaker versus Mankind. The battleground? Hell in a Cell. According to those who were there, Hell in a Cell hits you like a mallet to the consciousness. Fans and insiders alike knew it was going to be intense. But no one, absolutely no one, could have predicted the sheer magnitude of what was about to unfold. We had two unique talents out there, performers who relished pushing the envelope until it teetered over the absolute edge. People often say wrestling is a scripted performance, but let me tell you this, you cannot fake gravity. In my many years covering this industry, I have been frightened by a lot of things inside the squared circle. But nothing frightened me as much as what happened on that fateful June night. What left fans completely stunned was the unrelenting, unimaginable punishment that Mick Foley, the man behind the Mankind mask, willingly endured until you saw it with your own eyes. You simply did not believe that a human being could physically undergo this level of trauma and live to tell the tale. The pain was real. The drama was profoundly real. Backstage, peers and executives were cursing, screaming, and questioning his sanity, asking the fundamental question, why are you doing this? Today, this infamous match persists as both an epic success and a grim cautionary tale. According to veteran analysts and performers, the industry dodged multiple fatal bullets that day. When you look back at the footage, it is genuinely staggering to realize that a company will allow a performer to lose consciousness and then, against all medical logic, continue the match. The collateral damage that ensued from these decisions is a story of its own. It forces us to ask, when does it stop? When is it enough? Because the tragic reality of this business is that you pay all day long for the decisions you make during your 15 minutes in the spotlight. It was a dangerously crazy masterpiece. But as we dissect the events, we must ask ourselves, was it truly worth it? The psychology of a hardcore legend. To understand the madness of Hell in a Cell, we first have to understand the mind of Mick Foley. Everyone who steps into the chaotic world of professional wrestling is usually looking for something they find missing in their own lives. For Foley, his motivation was rooted deeply in his childhood. According to his own accounts, he was teased heavily in his youth, which fostered an overwhelming need to be accepted, to be liked, and ultimately to hold that prestigious World Wrestling Federation Championship. Foley's desperate need for a reaction started early. During his sophomore year of college, he pulled a stunt that would foreshadow his entire career. He took a swig of red food coloring and took a massive leap off a bed, crashing onto a concrete floor. When he hit the ground, he spat out the fake blood. A female student watching the spectacle screamed that it was the most disgusting thing she had ever seen. In that moment, Foley felt power. His logic became clear. If he could not make people love him, perhaps he could disgust them. He simply needed a reaction. This relentless pursuit of crowds' roar birthed a career defined by brutality. While Hell in a Cell is often a gateway for new fans, it is vital to note that a normal Mick Foley match was already a theater of pain. He built his legacy on barbed wire, thumbtacks, and fire. He subjected his body to composition for explosives in Japan. He was speared through flaming tables and took devastating falls directly onto exposed concrete. His daughter, Noelle Foley, noted that her father genuinely loved extracting that visceral reaction of horror and shock from the audience. Realism was his greatest tool. Foley himself admitted that he did not believe he had a good match unless he had physical trouble simply walking back to his hotel room. It was not that he enjoyed the physical pain. Rather, he found joy in his ability to endure it and present it to the audience in an entertaining way. The woman behind the mask. Behind every gladiator, there is a family that must bear the emotional brunt of the battles. Colette Foley, who has known Mick for over 35 years, saw a different side of the hardcore legend. When she first met him, she did not see a monster. She saw a gentle, kind person with gentle eyes. It was his corny jokes and terrible humor that won her heart. Their wedding song was, fittingly, Beauty and the Beast. Colette understood his immense commitment to his craft. She knew that when the adrenaline pumped through his veins, his sole drive was to ensure the fans went home talking about the show, even at his own extreme physical risk. To achieve this, Foley initially developed a persona of Cactus Jack, a wild, unpredictable character that captured the audience's attention through sheer charisma and insanity. Veteran producer Jim Cornette noted that Foley possessed masterful psychological instincts in the ring. Foley understood that fans gravitated towards a performer who seemed genuinely out of control, someone who appeared to be going completely off the script. By taking the audience on an unpredictable, chaotic ride, he forced the spotlight onto himself. From Japan to the World Wrestling Federation, Foley's dedication to his craft was absolute. He and Colette lived humbly in the early days. A mattress on the floor, a tiny black and white television, and a struggling video cassette recorder that played 12 hours of Japanese wrestling tapes a day. Foley was captivated by the realism and storytelling of the Japanese death match, where a competitor had to defeat not just their opponent, but their perilous surroundings. He found his footing in Japan, mentored by the legendary Terry Funk, a master making audiences suspend their disbelief. Together, they engaged in explosive, violent, and fiery death matches. Foley would crawl on his hands and knees through broken glass and wire, viewing the scars as proof that he was doing something special. Because of his extreme style, Foley never envisioned himself in the World Wrestling Federation. At that time, the company was heavily geared toward the general audience, presenting a relatively sterile, family-friendly product. Foley's travel partner and close friend, Al Snow, recalled that Chairman Mr. McMahon initially had no interest in Foley, viewing him as unmarketable and unattractive. However, Jim Ross, who served as Vice President of Talent Relations, saw raw potential. He needed fresh opponents for The Undertaker, one of the biggest stars in the history of the business. Mr. McMahon had been feeding giants to The Undertaker, a formula that was growing stale. Ross knew they needed a lunatic. According to backstage lore, Mr. McMahon finally slammed his hand on a desk and agreed to hire Foley, but with one strict condition. They had to cover his face with mask. From this directive, the character of Mankind was born. Hall of Famer Gerald Briscoe recalled the immense challenge of building a character out of essentially nothing. Yet, this bizarre concept succeeded solely because of Mick Foley's unmatched ability to connect with an audience. His commitment was total. As Ross noted, Foley would not turn down any challenge. The new problem for the producers was not motivating Foley, but finding a way to stop him from destroying himself. The conception of the cell. Foley and The Undertaker went on to build a remarkable foundation, wrestling in 7 pay-per-view matches and 10 television matches across the globe. But by the summer of 1998, Foley felt his character had plateaued. He believed he needed to do something drastic to cement their legacy. For the King of the Ring event, producers decided to place the 2 men inside Hell in a cell. The concept of the cell, a cage or the roof where escaping over the top or through the door was theoretically impossible, had only been used once before. That first match, featuring The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, was a masterpiece, setting an incredibly high bar. Foley openly admitted he did not possess the athletic prowess of Shawn Michaels. Searching for a way to stand out, Foley sought advice from his mentor, Terry Funk. Funk jokingly suggested that they start the match on top of the cell roof, and that Foley should get thrown off. What started as a dark joke took root in Foley's mind. He pitched the idea to The Undertaker and Mr. McMahon. The Undertaker was extremely hesitant about throwing a man off a structure that high, but Foley's relentless persuasion eventually secured their reluctant agreement. Foley viewed this match not as a career renaissance, but as a final, desperate attempt to keep his head above water. He fully believed that when this run ended, his career would be over. The first fall. On the night of the match, 16,000 fans packed the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. As the ominous structure was lowered, Foley made his entrance. Instead of entering the cell door, he began to climb the exterior wall. The crowd, the commentators, and the officials were visibly shocked. Backstage, producer Jimmy Corderas watched the monitors in disbelief. Lead announcer Jim Ross and his broadcast partner Jerry Lawler were completely in the dark about the planned stunt. Foley had assured management he was comfortable with the height, but the truth was he was terrified. He admitted he was not good with heights, and as he waited on top of the cage for The Undertaker, he privately wondered how he could gracefully climb down without ruining his career. When The Undertaker joined him on the roof, the true danger of the situation became apparent. The top of the cage was secured with simple plastic zip ties. With 600 pounds of human weight shifting on the mesh, the roof began to visibly give way, sinking by nearly a foot with every step. The sound of zip ties violently snapping echoed through the arena. An early attempt by Foley to suplex The Undertaker was quickly abandoned. The Undertaker realized that such a move would likely send them both plummeting through the unstable roof. Instead, they brawled toward the edge of the cell, directly above the Spanish announcer's table. Jim Ross recalled watching them near the edge, praying that they would not attempt anything foolish. The margin for error was microscopic. The announcer table looked like a tiny dollhouse from that height. Then it happened. The Undertaker grabbed Mankind and hurled him off the edge of the cell. A 300-pound man fell nearly 20 feet, crashing violently through the broadcast table. The visual was horrifying. The sound of the impact was sickening. Backstage, peers and executives exploded in panic, reacting as if they had just witnessed a fatal car accident. Announcer Hugo Savanovic had to literally dive out his chair to avoid being crushed. The audience gasped in collective horror. Many believed they had just watched a man die on live television. Colette Foley, watching at home with her young children, desperately tried to soothe them by insisting it was fake, even as she silently panicked. Medical personnel, led by Dr. Francois Petit, alongside Terry Funk and Mr. McMahon, rushed to the ringside area. Dr. Francois noted that Foley had landed disastrously on his back and dislocated his shoulder. A stretcher was brought out. The match, it seemed, was definitively over. Foley was strapped to the gurney and wheeled down the aisle. The second fall. But the story did not end there. As Foley was being wheeled away, he realized that the longer he prolonged the drama, the more invested the audience became. In a display of sheer, incomprehensible willpower, he rolled off the stretcher. Ignoring the pleas of officials telling him the match was over, he marched back to the ring and began climbing the cell once again. The audience erupted. Backstage, however, panic set in. Everyone knew what Foley had initially planned, but no one knew what was going to happen next. The Undertaker met him on top of the roof once more. The planned sequence called for a choke slam, which was supposed to cause the cage mesh to safely and gradually give way, leaving Foley dangling. That is not what happened. When the Undertaker delivered the choke slam, the zip ties failed entirely. The panel of the cage gave way instantly, and Foley plummeted straight through the roof, plummeting roughly 15 feet and slamming with catastrophic force onto the unforgiving ring canvas. To make matters infinitely worse, a heavy steel folding chair fell for the hole right behind him, striking him directly in the face upon impact. Jim Ross, screaming at the monitors, completely lost his composure. He later admitted he tried to call the executives backstage to stop the match, but could not reach anyone. The impact was equivalent to a 25-mile-per-hour car crash. Foley lay completely motionless. It was the first time in his entire career that he had been legitimately knocked unconscious. The cage was immediately flooded with personnel. When Dr. Francois and Terry Funk reached him, Foley was unresponsive. The Undertaker, looking down from the roof, instructed Funk to check if Foley was even still alive. Funk confirmed he was breathing. For 42 seconds, Mick Foley was completely blacked out. Realizing the gravity of the situation and needing to buy the medical team precious time, Terry Funk improvised. He attacked the Undertaker, drawing the focus away from the lifeless Foley. According to Jim Ross, if there was ever a match in the history of the industry that should have been stopped, it was this one. But in that era, matches were rarely halted. Performers simply bought time. Incredibly, Foley regained consciousness. His first sight was Terry Funk's shoes. Disoriented and severely concussed, his instinct as a performer took over. He realized he had a massive, gaping wound below his lip. In a moment of grotesque showmanship, he pushed his tongue to the hole in his face to create a gruesome visual for cameras. He was also sporting a bizarre smile, revealing a missing tooth that had been knocked out by the steel chair. Medical reports later suggested the tooth had been knocked into his throat, and due to his heavy breathing, it had traveled up and lodged in his nasal passage. The bloody climax. Despite suffering a severe concussion, a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, and a bruised kidney, Foley insisted on finishing the match. The pain was real. The concern in the Undertaker's eyes was real, but Foley's determination was unyielding. To ensure the fans got their money's worth, Foley called for his signature thumbtacks. Thousands of sharp tacks were scattered across the ring canvas. Foley willingly took several brutal impacts directly onto the tacks, purposely rolling around to ensure they stuck to his body. He understood that risking his well-being cemented the audience's belief in him. Finally, after 17 grueling minutes, The Undertaker delivered a final maneuver and pinned Mankind. The match was over, but the legend was permanently cemented. 16,000 fans in Pittsburgh had witnessed a spectacle of human endurance that defied logic. When Foley returned backstage, he was greeted by a horrified but grateful locker room. While Dr. Francois agonizingly plucked thumbtacks from Foley's flesh, Mr. McMahon approached him. The chairman thanked Foley for everything he had done for company, but firmly demanded that he never do anything like that again. The physical toll was immense. 15 stitches, 2 missing teeth, and weeks of recovery for his internal injuries. But professionally, the match changed everything. Within 6 months, the man who was once deemed too unattractive and unmarketable to hire became the World Wrestling Federation champion. The I Quit match and the ultimate price. However, the bar for violence had been irreparably raised. Just 7 months later, Foley found himself pushing his limits once again, this time against The Rock in an infamous I Quit match. The match was designed to be brutal, but things spiraled dangerously out of control. The script called for Foley to take 5 unprotected steel chair shots to the head, while handcuffed. Foley, ever perfectionist, instructed The Rock to hit him hard. Instead of 5 shots, Foley absorbed 11 horrifying, unprotected strikes to his skull. His wife and young children were seated in the front row, forced to watch as their father was brutally battered. Noelle Foley later confessed that she has absolutely no memory of her father wrestling, a psychological block likely caused by the extreme trauma of watching him absorb such horrific punishment. The collateral damage of these decisions is heartbreaking. For the sake of a television storyline, Foley sustained severe brain trauma. The long-term consequences of such extreme physical sacrifice are impossible to ignore. Today, medical science understands much more about chronic traumatic encephalopathy and the devastating effects of repetitive concussions. Foley eventually sought independent medical advice after accompanying neurologists warned him to never wrestle again. He experienced memory lapses, sometimes driving around and forgetting where he lived. His loved ones live in constant worry about what his health will look like in 10 or 20 years. To combat the cognitive decline, Foley now focuses on spoken word tours, treating the performances as mental gymnastics to keep his mind sharp and to continue feeling the stimulation of a live audience. Was it worth it? Mick Foley is a multiple-time champion, a best-selling author, and charitable figure. Yet, he knows he will forever be defined by Hell in a Cell. For years, he harbored resentment toward the match, feeling that his entire life's work was eclipsed by one chaotic evening. It left him in a dark place, feeling as though he had accomplished nothing else of value. But time offers perspective. A conversation with The Undertaker helped Foley realize that what they created that night would outlive them both. He eventually embraced the legacy. When Foley recently visited the company warehouse and touched the original cell, the emotion overwhelmed him. A man who built his career on pain broke down in tears. It was a profound realization of his own mortality and the sheer luck that allowed him to walk away from that structure alive. As observers, we must view Hell in a Cell as a paradox. It was a masterpiece of storytelling and a testament to human endurance, but it was also a terrifying display of unnecessary risk. According to the documents and testimonies, there is no financial reward big enough to justify the danger Foley put himself in. Yet, when asked if he would do it differently knowing what we now know about head injuries, Foley remains uncertain. The world offered him a canvas to create what he called surreal, sublime performance art. For Mick Foley, the roar of the crowd, the widening of their eyes, and their absolute belief in his sacrifice made it all worthwhile. It was a magical, brutal way to make a living, and on that June night, it provided one of the most powerful, enduring moments in the history of sports entertainment. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the shadows of the squared circle. Good night. Dark Side of the Ring, The Descent of Mankind. Act 1, The Architecture of a Masochist. On the 28th of June, 1998, the world of professional wrestling changed forever. Inside the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, a sprawling structure of steel was lowered from the rafters for the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring event. It was a concept designed to evoke sheer terror. Hell in a Cell. What happened under that roof that night persists in the annals of sports entertainment as both an epic success and a grim cautionary tale. To understand the madness of that summer night, we must first understand the mind of the man who willingly walked into the abyss. Mick Foley, known to masses as Mankind, was a man driven by a desperate, almost tragic need for acceptance. According to Foley himself, his childhood was marred by isolation. He possessed an overwhelming need to be liked. When he realized he could not easily win the adoration of his peers, he discovered a darker currency, shock. As a college sophomore, Foley once swallowed red food coloring and leapt off a bed onto a concrete floor, spitting the faux blood to the disgust and awe of his dorm mates. In that moment of revulsion, he found power. If he could not make them love him, he would make them sick to their stomachs. This craving for a reaction led Foley across the globe. He forged his path not in the glitz and glamour of American television, but in the brutal, visceral death match of Japan. Immersing himself in videocassette tapes for 12 hours a day, he studied the psychology of violence. Under mentorship of the legendary Terry Funk, a man widely considered the greatest at making audiences suspend disbelief, Foley embraced fire, barbed wire, and composition for explosives. He believed that bleeding on the concrete was proof that he was doing something special. Yet, despite his international infamy, the gates of the World Wrestling Federation were initially closed to him. Vince McMahon, the architect of the empire, saw no value in Foley. According to Jim Ross, who served as vice president of talent relations at the time, McMahon did not find Foley marketable or attractive. The product was in a family-friendly era, and Foley's brand of visceral realism did not fit the mold. But Ross saw something undeniable. He urged McMahon to take a chance. McMahon finally relented, slamming his hand on a table with a strict condition: Foley's face must be covered. From this directive of disdain, the character of Mankind was born, a masked, tortured soul designed for one singular purpose: to be a compelling sacrificial lamb for the company's greatest attraction, The Undertaker. Act 2, pushing the envelope. Foley and The Undertaker traveled the globe, laying a foundation across 7 pay-per-view events and 10 television matches. But by 1998, the Mankind character had plateaued. Foley felt an overwhelming pressure to elevate their legacy. 9 months prior, The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels had competed in the inaugural Hell in a Cell match. It was a masterpiece of storytelling and athleticism that set an almost insurmountable standard. Foley knew he lacked the nimble grace of Michaels. If he could not out-wrestle the past, he decided he would out-survive it. According to behind-the-scenes accounts, it was a joking conversation with Terry Funk that planted the seed of insanity. Funk chuckled and suggested that Foley should start the match on the roof of the cage and get thrown off. What was meant as dark humor became a terrifying fixation for Foley. He pitched the idea casually to McMahon and The Undertaker. The Undertaker was heavily opposed to throwing his opponent off the immense structure, but Foley was relentless. He saw this match not as a second act to his career, but as a desperate bid to keep his head above water. He genuinely believed that after this run, his career would be over. As the 16,000 fans in Pittsburgh watched Foley make his way to the ring, no one could have anticipated the horrors that were about to unfold. Act 3, the fall that stopped time. When the match began, Foley did not enter the cage door. He began to climb. At the commentary desk, Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were entirely in the dark. The live audience murmured in confusion and mounting dread. Backstage, the production crew, led by Gerald Briscoe, sat glued to their monitors. Foley, who privately harbored a severe fear of heights, reached the top of the chain-link roof. The Undertaker followed. They stood nearly 20 feet above the concrete arena floor. According to sources, the top section of the cage was merely secured with zip ties. As 600 pounds of human weight shifted across the mesh, the roof gave way by a foot. The sound of plastic ties snapping echoed through the arena. The battle inched dangerously close to the edge. Down below, the Spanish announcer's desk looked like a fragile dollhouse. Then, in a moment that defied all logic and human instinct, the Undertaker grabbed Foley and hurled him into the abyss. Time seemed to slow down. A 300-pound man plummeted through the air, crashing violently through the announcer's table. Hugo Savinovic, the Spanish commentator, barely escaped being crushed. The sound of the impact was sickening. Backstage, the locker room erupted in absolute panic. It looked like a fatal car crash. Jim Ross, broadcasting live to millions, famously shouted that the man had been broken in half. For all intents and purposes, the match was over. Terry Funk, breaking the cardinal rule of non-interference, rushed to the wreckage to check if Foley was still breathing. Dr. Francois Petit, the company's eccentric but brilliant medical professional, sprinted down the aisle. Foley was loaded onto a stretcher. The crowd stood in stunned silence. The reality of gravity had pierced the illusion of professional wrestling. Act 4, the unscripted catastrophe. But Foley was not finished. Driven by an unfathomable commitment to his craft and the roar of the crowd, Foley fought off the medical personnel. With a dislocated shoulder, he forced himself off the stretcher. Against the desperate pleas of everyone around him, he began to climb the cell once more. If the first fall was a calculated, carefully executed stunt, what happened next was pure, unadulterated catastrophe. The script called for The Undertaker to chokeslam Foley onto the mesh, intending for the roof to sag dramatically. Instead, the cage gave way entirely. Foley plummeted straight through the roof, crashing violently onto the unforgiving wooden boards of the ring below. It was a fall entirely devoid of preparation. To make matters worse, a heavy steel folding chair fell through the breach directly behind him, striking him square in the face upon impact. Silence fell over the arena. Backstage, anger mixed with terror. Even his closest friends believed he was dead. This was the first time in his career that Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious. He lay motionless. The Undertaker, looking down from the torn roof, instructed Terry Funk to see if his opponent was still alive. Funk desperately bought time, taking a physical confrontation with The Undertaker just to divert the audience's eyes away from the tragedy unfolding on the mat. 42 seconds vanished from Foley's memory. When he finally regained consciousness, the sight was macabre. He was bleeding profusely from a massive wound beneath his lip. One of his teeth had been knocked entirely out of his mouth due to his heavy breathing. It had traveled up his throat and lodged inside his nostril. Yet, in a display of frightening dedication, Foley pushed his tongue to the hole in his lip and smiled for the cameras. The 17-minute match concluded only after Foley introduced thousands of metal thumbtacks into the ring, intentionally taking falls onto the sharp steel to elicit one final roar from the crowd. When the bell finally rang, the audience knew they had witnessed something entirely real. Act 5, The Price of Fame. Foley returned backstage to a mixture of awe and reprimand. Vince McMahon greeted him with immense gratitude, followed immediately by a stern demand that Foley never do anything like that again. Medical staff worked frantically to pluck thumbtacks from his flesh. He had a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, 15 stitches in his lip, a bruised kidney that would ache for 6 weeks, and an undocumented concussion. The match fundamentally altered the trajectory of his career. 6 months later, the man McMahon once deemed unmarketable was crowned the world champion. But the bar had been raised, and the pressure to over-deliver became an addiction. Just 7 months later, Foley pushed the boundaries again in a notoriously brutal I Quit match against The Rock. The original plan called for 5 steel chair strikes to the head. In the heat of the moment, Foley took 11. With his wife Colette and his young children in the front row, the line between scripted entertainment and genuine trauma was obliterated. His daughter, Noelle, recalls the sickening fear of watching her father sustain what could have been fatal brain damage for the sake of television. According to medical professionals, the human body is not built to withstand such punishment. A single bump in the ring is likened to a 25-mile-per-hour car collision. Foley endured concussions upon concussions. Independent neurologists explicitly warned him to retire, stating that if he continued, he would end up crippled. The shadow of chronic traumatic encephalopathy looms heavily over his legacy. Today, Foley admits to struggling with memory loss, fighting a daily battle against the long-term effects of repetitive brain trauma. Epilogue, was it worth it? Mick Foley sacrificed his body, his neurological future, and the peace of mind of his family, all to earn the acceptance of total strangers. For years, he harbored resentment toward the Hell in a cell match, frustrated that his entire career was defined by a single night of torture. Yet, as time passed, perspective shifted. During a reflective conversation, The Undertaker told Foley that what they created that night would outlive them both. It was a masochistic masterpiece, a terrifying display of human endurance that forever etched Foley's name into the foundation of professional wrestling history. When Foley recently visited a company warehouse and laid his hands on the original steel panels of the cell, the weight of history brought the hardcore legend to tears. It was a realization of how fragile life truly is, and how close he came to losing it all. He survived the cell. He achieved his lifelong dream of being loved by the masses. But the question remains, echoing to the empty arenas and the halls of medical offices, lingering in the minds of everyone who watched a man break himself in half for their entertainment. Was it truly worth it? The anatomy of a masterpiece. Hell in a Cell. Prologue, The Weight of Gravity. On June 28, 1998, at the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring pay-per-view, the industry witnessed a spectacle that would permanently alter the landscape of professional wrestling. The bout was The Undertaker versus Mankind inside the unforgiving steel structure known as Hell in a Cell. According to the accounts of those who lived it, this match hits the consciousness like a heavy mallet. It was expected to be chaotic, but no one could have anticipated the sheer magnitude of the madness that would unfold. You had two talents out there who thrived on pushing the envelope, pushing it so far that it inevitably tipped over the edge. We often hear the refrain that professional wrestling is predetermined, but as anyone who watched that night will tell you, you cannot fake gravity. In my years of covering this industry, I have been frightened by many things inside the squared circle, but nothing instilled fear quite like this event. What left fans across the globe completely stunned was the unrelenting, sheer physical punishment that Mick Foley endured. Until you saw it with your own eyes, you simply would not believe that a human being could physically sustain that level of trauma and survive. The match was real. The pain was undeniably real. The drama unfolding in front of 16,000 people was real. According to colleagues watching backstage, the reaction was a mixture of awe and absolute terror, with many cursing, screaming, and questioning the sanity of the man putting his life on the line. Why go to such extremes? This infamous match persists today as both an epic success in sports entertainment and a harrowing cautionary tale. As observers noted that night, the industry dodged several fatal bullets. It remains a staggering thought that a performer could be rendered completely unconscious, only for the match to continue. The collateral damage that ensued from that night, and the decisions made during those 15 minutes in the spotlight, is a debt paid over a lifetime. It was a dangerously crazy masterpiece. But it forces all of us to ask the definitive question, was it worth it? Part 1. The Psychology of a Masochist. To understand the events of 1998, we must first analyze the mind of the man known as the hardcore legend. According to Foley's own reflections, everyone who enters the wrestling business is searching for something missing in their own lives. For Mick Foley, a childhood filled with being teased birthed an overwhelming, insatiable need to be liked, and a driving ambition to capture the championship belt. This psychological need manifested early. According to a story from his sophomore year in college, Foley once took a swig of red food coloring and executed a flying leap off a bed, crashing onto a concrete floor. As he spit the blood-like concoction out, the reaction of his peers, a visceral disgust, gave him an intoxicating sense of power. If he could not command their love, he realized he could at least command their absolute shock. He needed reactions. He needed to be noticed. For many fans, the Hell in a Cell match is a gateway into the sport. It is the first match they are shown. But as Foley's own children note, it creates a false expectation. A normal Mick Foley match was already inherently brutal, often involving thumbtacks, fire, barbed wire, or C4 explosives in Japan. He was a man willing to be speared through flaming tables or take punishing falls directly onto concrete. As his daughter Noelle observed, he simply loved eliciting that visceral gasp from the audience. Realism was his ultimate tool. He admittedly did not enjoy the physical pain, but he found immense satisfaction in his ability to endure it and project it into compelling storytelling. He gauged the success of his performances by how difficult it was to walk back to his hotel room. Yet, behind his terrifying on-screen persona was a remarkably gentle man. Colette Foley, who has known Mick for over 35 years, fell in love not with a monster, but with a kind man possessing terrible humor and an affinity for corny jokes. Their wedding song was fittingly, Beauty and the Beast. But she understood his deep commitment to his craft. When the adrenaline pumped, his singular drive was to ensure the audience left talking about the show, even at the severe risk of his own well-being. Part 2, The Road to Mankind. Before the cell, there was Cactus Jack, a wild, unpredictable, and seemingly unhinged persona. Jim Cornette, a producer for the company at the time, recognized Foley's brilliant grasp of ring psychology. Foley understood that fans were captivated by chaos, by performers who appeared to completely disregard the script. He could take the audience on an emotional ride, and in doing so, his reputation exploded. His education was unconventional. His bedroom furniture once consisted of a mattress on the floor and a broken television continuously, playing Japanese wrestling tapes for up to 12 hours a day. He was drawn to the realism and the intense storytelling of the Japanese death match, where a competitor had to defeat not just their opponent, but their perilous surroundings. It was in Japan that Foley found a mentor in Terry Funk, widely regarded as a master of suspending disbelief. Together, they engaged in explosive, fiery, and bloody deathmatch. Foley spent hours crawling through debris, viewing his scars as proof that he was creating something special. He saw Japan as a forever home, never envisioning himself fitting into the pristine, curated mold of the World Wrestling Federation at that time. And initially, he was right. According to executive Jim Ross, Chairman Vince McMahon had absolutely no desire to hire Mick Foley. McMahon did not see him as marketable or attractive. Ross had to leverage his own reputation to give Foley a chance, recognizing that the company desperately needed a unique, chaotic opponent for one of their biggest stars, The Undertaker. The era of matching The Undertaker against slow, plodding giants had grown stale. They needed a lunatic. McMahon famously capitulated, slamming his hand on a table and agreeing to bring Foley in under the strict condition that his face be covered. Thus, the character of Mankind was born. According to Hall of Famer Jerry Briscoe, the creative team was tasked with building a compelling character out of a mandate designed to hide the performer. Yet, this supposed punishment became Foley's greatest asset. Without Foley's unparalleled ability to connect with an audience, the bizarre mask and character would have failed miserably. He threw himself into the role with reckless abandon. As Jim Ross noted, Foley was willing to try absolutely anything to succeed. The immediate challenge for management was no longer getting him over with the crowd. It was keeping him from killing himself in the process. Part 3, The Pitch and the Plunge. Mankind and The Undertaker built a legendary foundation together, clashing in 7 pay-per-view events and 10 television matches across the globe. But by 1998, Foley felt his character was plateauing. He needed a moment that would cement their legacy, not detract from it. The stage was set for King of the Ring, utilizing a recently developed concept, Hell in a Cell. The traditional cage match allowed a victor to escape over the top or through the door. The cell was different. It had a roof. 2 men enter, 1 leaves. The bar had been set astronomically high 9 months prior, when Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker competed in the inaugural Hell in a Cell match, about many still consider the technical pinnacle of the match type. Foley watched that match in awe, fully aware that he possessed none of the athletic agility of Shawn Michaels. He needed a different approach. According to Foley, he consulted his mentor, Terry Funk. In a moment of dark humor, Funk jokingly suggested that they start the match on top of the structure, and Foley should get thrown off. What started as a laugh became a terrifying obsession. Foley pitched the idea casually to McMahon and The Undertaker. Both were initially highly skeptical. The Undertaker was not on board with throwing his opponent off a massive structure, but Foley was resolute. He viewed this not as a long-term career strategy, but as a desperate attempt to keep his head above water, fully believing his career was nearing its end. As the match approached, the anticipation was palpable. Commentator Jim Ross noted the immense pressure on Foley, knowing he had to outdo the inaugural match while lacking nimbleness. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. Referee Jimmy Corderas, watching from the production monitors alongside Gerald Briscoe, had the perfect vantage point. No one knew exactly what to anticipate, and no one could have imagined the reality. When Mankind's music hit, he bypassed the door and immediately began scaling the cell. The shock was universal. Foley had assured management he had tested the roof, but according to his own admission, he was terrified of heights. The sight of Mankind standing atop the monstrous structure established an immediate sense of dread. When the Undertaker joined him, the reality of the danger became apparent. The roof was secured by zip ties. With over 600 pounds of human weight shifting across the mesh, the panels began to buckle, dropping by a foot with every step. Zip ties could be heard snapping like gunfire. The structure was failing. Foley attempted a suplex, which the Undertaker smartly countered. Realizing the mesh was close to completely giving way, they migrated toward the edge of the cage, hovering above the announce tables. Observers backstage and at ringside thought there was no margin for error. The tables below looked like tiny dollhouse furniture. Then it happened. A 300-pound human being was hurled from nearly 20 feet in the air. Time seemed to warp. It moved in agonizing slow motion, yet finished in the blink of an eye. The impact of Foley crashing through the Spanish announce table produced a sound that terrified everyone in the arena. The reaction was instinctual. Broadcasters, fans, and colleagues exploded in concern. According to those watching, it felt like witnessing a horrific car accident. The collective thought was unified. He is dead. There was an audible, horrified gasp from the 16,000 in attendance. At home, families struggled to process the violence, desperately trying to reassure terrified children that it was just a show. But the danger was all too real. Had the Undertaker thrown him a fraction too far or too short, Foley would have hit the concrete or the spectators. Miraculously, Foley had the presence of mind to adjust his body mid-air, landing as flat as possible on the table to cushion the catastrophic fall. Dr. Francois Petit, the company's eccentric and highly skilled medical professional, rushed to the scene alongside Terry Funk. Foley had landed terribly on his back and on a dislocated shoulder. EMTs struggled to bring a gurney through the wreckage. The match was seemingly over. He was secured to the board. But as the gurney moved up the aisle, the unimaginable happened. Foley, realizing the crowd was entirely captivated, rose from the stretcher. With a dislocated shoulder and a battered body, he began the arduous climb back up the cell. Part 4. The Unplanned Disaster. Backstage, officials and peers screamed at the monitors, pleading for him to stay down. His return created an aura of absolute invincibility, turning him into a massive star in that exact moment. But what happened next was not part of the plan. The next sequence was supposed to be a visual spectacle, a choke slam on the roof that would cause the mesh to sag dramatically. However, the weakened zip ties failed entirely. The Undertaker chokeslammed Mankind, and the mesh tore open. Foley plummeted freely into the ring, crashing violently onto the unforgiving surface. This impact was vastly different from the first. The ring mat offers little protection. Falling from that height is akin to hitting solid cement. Compounding the tragedy, a heavy steel folding chair fell through the opening directly behind him, striking him brutally in the face upon impact. This was the moment genuine panic set in. According to his family and colleagues, they thought he was gone. His wife was furious, believing he had hidden this dangerous stunt from her. But the truth was far more frightening. It was an accident. For the first time in his career, Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious. Medical staff, alongside Terry Funk, flooded the ring. The Undertaker, looking down from the broken roof, instructed Funk to check if Foley was even breathing. For 42 agonizing seconds, Foley had no memory of the event. In a desperate bid to buy time, Terry Funk initiated a physical altercation with The Undertaker, taking a choke slam himself to distract the audience while doctors tended to Foley. According to industry standards of the time, matches were rarely stopped for injury. Performers simply bought time. When Foley finally regained consciousness, his first sight was Terry Funk's shoes. Operating on pure instinct and adrenaline, he rose to his feet. His face was a horrific mass of trauma. A severe wound tore through his lower lip, and in a macabre display of showmanship, he pushed his tongue through the hole for the cameras. More shockingly, a tooth had been knocked out by the chair and had lodged inside his nasal cavity, a result of violent inhalation during the trauma. The match continued. The pain, the drama, the sheer terror in the eyes of everyone involved were completely real. Foley, still severely concussed, demanded the introduction of thumbtacks. He purposely threw his battered body onto the tacks, ensuring they stuck to his flesh to maximize the visual impact. The adrenaline masked the agony. He was no longer just experiencing pain. He had become a part of it. After 17 harrowing minutes, The Undertaker secured the victory. Foley refused the stretcher once again, walking out to a crowd that had been pushed to the absolute limits of their emotional endurance. Part 5. The Aftermath and the Toll. The immediate aftermath backstage was a scene of profound relief and severe caution. Vince McMahon approached Foley, thanked him for his unimaginable sacrifice, and sternly demanded that he never attempt anything like it again. Foley, still in a haze, asked The Undertaker if they had executed the thumbtack spot, completely unaware that a doctor was actively pulling them out of his body at that very moment. The physical toll was staggering. A dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a severely bruised kidney that plagued him for 6 weeks, 15 stitches beneath his lip, and 2 lost teeth. Yet, professionally, the gamble paid off. The match fundamentally altered how the audience perceived him. 6 months later, the man Vince McMahon, once deemed unmarketable, became the world champion. But the bar had been irreversibly raised. The hunger for the audience's roar pushed Foley to continually escalate the violence. Just 7 months later, he engaged in a brutal I Quit match with The Rock. Against the advice of his peers, Foley took 11 unprotected steel chair shots to the head, hands cupped behind his back. According to his daughter, the footage of that match remains a source of deep trauma. The line between scripted entertainment and horrifying reality was obliterated. He had sustained legitimate brain damage for a television storyline. The long-term consequences of such reckless physical sacrifice are grim. Foley endured concussion after concussion. There were days he would drive and forget where he lived. Independent neurologists explicitly warned him to stop wrestling, warning of permanent damage. Today, the medical community understands the devastating reality of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a terrifying consequence of repetitive brain trauma. The impact of a wrestling fall is often compared to a 25-mile-per-hour car crash. Foley's future health remains a daily source of deep anxiety for his family. Epilogue: The Price of Legacy. Mick Foley is a man who gave his physical being to the industry. He pushed the absolute limits of human endurance to earn the acceptance of total strangers. For years, he harbored resentment toward the Hell in a cell match, feeling it overshadowed everything else he had accomplished. But time and a conversation with The Undertaker brought perspective. The Undertaker reminded him that what they created that night would outlive them both. It was a piece of surreal, sublime performance art painted in blood and unimaginable risk. Recently, while visiting a company warehouse, Foley came face to face with the original cell. According to his daughter, he touched the steel and began to weep, a rare display of emotion for a man who had endured so much. It was a stark reminder of his own mortality, a realization of how perilously close he came to losing everything. There is no monetary reward significant enough to truly cover that level of risk. While Foley admits he might have made different choices had the modern science of head injuries been available, he looks back on his career with a complex fondness. To step into the arena, to command the awe of thousands, to hear that deafening roar, it was a magical way to make a living. But as the cheers fade into history and the physical bill comes due, the legacy of Hell in a Cell remains an enduring, haunting question for the industry and the fans who consume it. We asked them to give us everything, but did we ever stop to ask what it would cost them? The Dark Side of the Ring, The Ballad of Mankind. Voiceover, deep resonant, with the gravitas of a seasoned sports broadcaster. Professional wrestling is a world built on illusions. It is a spectacle of predetermined outcomes. A grand theater where heroes and villains clash under the bright arena lights. We are told it is entertainment. We are told to suspend our disbelief. But there is an undeniable, chilling truth that lingers in the shadows of the squared circle. You cannot fake gravity. On June 28, 1998, at the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring pay-per-view event, that reality came crashing down. It was a night that etched itself into the annals of sports entertainment, delivering a spectacle that hit the collective consciousness of the audience like a mallet. The Undertaker versus Mankind, Hell in a Cell. This is not just a story about a wrestling match. This is a forensic examination of human endurance, a psychological study of a man who pushed the envelope until it fell over the absolute edge, and a cautionary tale about the collateral damage of seeking acceptance in front of a roaring crowd, one of wrestling's most infamous encounters. This match persists as both an epic success and a terrifying moment where tragedy was separated from triumph by the slimmest of margins. The question that haunts his legacy is simple, yet profoundly heavy. When does it stop? When is it enough? And ultimately, was it worth it? Part 1. The Anatomy of an Enigma. To understand the sheer madness of that summer night in 1998, one must first look at the man behind the leather mask. Mick Foley was not your traditional wrestling superstar, according to those who knew him best. Everyone who enters the wrestling business is searching for something missing in their own lives. For Foley, a history of being teased fueled an overwhelming, almost desperate need to be liked. Documents and accounts from his early life paint a picture of a man willing to go to extremes for a reaction. As a college sophomore, he once consumed red food coloring before executing a diving leap off a bed, crashing onto a stuffed animal resting on a concrete floor, as the fake blood spewed from his mouth. The horrified reaction of a female onlooker, who called it the most disgusting thing she had ever seen, sparked a revelation. If he could not compel people to love him, he would settle for the immense power of disgusting them. Realism was a big tool. I didn't think I was having a good match unless I had trouble getting back to my hotel room. Foley thrived on the visceral reactions of the crowd. Whether it was a gasp of an audience or a collective shudder of revulsion, he needed that connection. He carved his path not through technical wizardry, but through an almost horrifying threshold for pain. From his early days competing in explosive, barbed wire, fire-laden death matches in Japan, often wrestling up to 12 hours a day on old tapes in a sparse apartment, he found his calling. Mentored by the legendary Terry Funk, Foley learned the art of suspending disbelief. He adopted the persona of Cactus Jack, a charismatic, unhinged brawler who took fans on an emotional, out-of-control ride. Yet, behind the violence was a gentle soul. His wife, Colette Foley, who stood by him for over 35 years, saw past the bloodshed. She noticed his kind eyes, his terrible humor, and the man who chose Beauty and the Beast as their wedding song. She understood his commitment, a drive to ensure fans left the arena talking about his performance, even at the severe risk of his own physical safety. Part 2, The Reluctant Arrival. Despite establishing a reputation as a hardcore legend worldwide, Foley was not the polished, corporate image desired by Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation. The company was operating in a heavily sanitized, family-friendly era. Foley, with his brutal style, simply did not fit the mold. McMahon, according to backstage accounts, did not find him marketable or attractive. It was Jim Ross, then the Vice President of Talent Relations, who championed Foley's cause. The WWF needed a compelling, unpredictable dancing partner for one of its greatest attractions, The Undertaker. McMahon had been feeding giants to the dead man, a formula that had grown stale and dull. Ross knew they needed a lunatic. Reluctantly, McMahon agreed to hire Foley, but with a strict condition. His face had to be covered. He was repackaged as Mankind, a tortured, masked intellectual who pulled out his own hair, in the hands of an ordinary performer. This gimmick would have been a catastrophic failure. But Foley injected his absolute soul into the character. His commitment was absolute. As veteran producer Jerry Briscoe noted, Foley would not turn down anything but the bed covers. The strategy worked. Mankind and The Undertaker engaged in a brutal, globe-trotting rivalry spanning 7 pay-per-view matches and 10 television main events. But as the summer of 1998 approached, Foley felt his character had plateaued. He needed a moment that would cement his legacy, not detract from it. Part 3. Designing the Descent. The concept of Hell in a Cell was relatively new. It had debuted just 9 months prior in a masterpiece between Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker. Traditional steel cage matches ended when a competitor escaped. Foley pitched a different idea to McMahon, a cage with a roof where 2 men enter and only 1 leaves. When it was decided that Mankind and The Undertaker would step into this demonic structure, Foley found himself paralyzed by the pressure. The inaugural cell match was a technical marvel. Foley knew he lacked the athletic agility of Shawn Michaels. To compensate, he sought the counsel of Terry Funk. During a brainstorming session, Funk jokingly suggested that they start the match on top of the cage, and that Foley should get thrown off. What started as a dark just planted a seed in Foley's mind. He pitched the idea to McMahon and The Undertaker. Initially met with resistance, Foley's persuasive conviction eventually won them over. He assured them he had been on top of the cell before and was comfortable with the height. That was a lie. Foley was terrified of heights. Part 4. The Flight of Mankind. When the lights went down at the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, a sold-out crowd of 16,000 people had no idea they were about to witness a defining moment in television history. As the menacing music of Mankind played, he did not enter the cage door. He began to climb. Backstage, the atmosphere shifted instantly from routine production to bewildered anxiety. Jimmy Corderas, a referee stationed at the monitor bank alongside Jerry Briscoe, recalled the sheer shock among the crew. No one expected a match to start 20 feet in the air. When The Undertaker followed him up, the reality of the situation became terrifyingly clear. 600 pounds of humanity now stood on a flimsy mesh roof secured only by zip ties. With every step, the metal sank by nearly a foot. The sound of zip ties snapping echoed through the arena. The structure was failing. Foley attempted a maneuver near the edge. The Undertaker, realizing the center of the roof was giving way, blocked it. They moved toward the precipice. Below them lay a drastically small Spanish announce table, looking less like a safety net and more like a fragile dollhouse prop. Then it happened. The Undertaker grabbed Mankind and hurled his 300-pound body off the top of the cage. To those watching, time both froze and accelerated. Foley plummeted almost 20 feet, violently crashing through the announce table. Spanish commentator Hugo Savanovic barely escaped being crushed. The sound of the impact was horrifying. Backstage, the locker room erupted in sheer panic. Colleagues genuinely believed they had just witnessed a fatal accident. This was an era where the lines of reality were tightly guarded, but in that moment, the curtain was violently ripped away. A man was lying motionless amidst splintered wood and twisted metal. Medical personnel, including Dr. Francois Petit, rushed the chaotic scene. Paramedics brought out a gurney. The match, by all logical and medical standards, was over. Foley was loaded onto the stretcher. The crowd stood in stunned silence. But as the gurney moved down the aisle, a terrifying realization washed over Foley. He knew that returning to the match would immortalize him. Against the frantic pleas of officials, doctors, and his peers, Foley rolled off the stretcher. Smiling a blood-stained macabre grin, he began the agonizing climb back up the cell. Part 5. The Unplanned Catastrophe. What followed was not part of the script. It was a terrifying accident that nearly cost McFoley his life. The plan was for The Undertaker to execute a chokeslam, a maneuver where he grabs his opponent by the throat and slams him into the mat on the roof of the cage. The intention was for the mesh to safely sag. Instead, the roof gave way entirely. Foley plummeted through the steel, free-falling to the solid, unyielding ring canvas below. He hit the mat with the force of a 25-mile-per-hour car crash. But the nightmare did not end with the impact. A heavy, solid steel folding chair that had been on the roof followed him down, striking him directly in the face upon his landing. Backstage, the panic turned to dread. This was a completely different scenario from the first fall. Foley lay lifeless, knocked unconscious for 42 agonizing seconds. The Undertaker, peering down through the gaping hole in the roof, instructed Terry Funk to check if Foley was still breathing. When Foley finally regained consciousness, the extent of the devastation was gruesome. His jaw was dislocated. He had a severe wound beneath his lip, and in a bizarre, horrifying visual that would define his career, one of his front teeth had been knocked out by the steel chair, lodged into his throat, and blown out through his nasal passage, where it sat visibly resting in his nostril. By any modern standard, the match should have been stopped. But in that era, matches were rarely halted. Time was simply bought. As Foley stood up, battered and concussed, the crowd witnessed a man transcending the bounds of physical endurance. In a final act of grotesque theatricality, Foley signaled for thumbtacks to be spread across the ring. He allowed himself to be slammed back first into thousands of the sharp pins, ensuring his body absorbed maximum punishment before The Undertaker finally secured the victory in the 17-minute match. Part 6. The Price of Immortality. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic blend of adulation and medical emergency. Foley waved off the stretcher once more, walking the back under his own power to a thunderous, legendary ovation. Behind the curtain, Vince McMahon met him with profound gratitude, but delivered a stern warning. Never attempt anything like that again. Dr. Petit plucked thumbtacks from Foley's flesh while assessing a horrifying list of injuries. A bruised kidney that would plague him for 6 weeks, a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, 15 facial stitches, and the loss of 2 teeth. The concussion, severe as it was, barely registered in the medical protocols of time. The toll extended far beyond Foley's battered body. For Colette Foley, the night was a waking nightmare. Without the customary post-match phone call to confirm his safety, she was left to wonder if her husband had survived. When he finally called hours later, her relief was instantly swallowed by deep, furious anger. Her children believed their father was dead. The implicit trust she held, that he would not jeopardize their family for a performance, was shattered. Yet, professionally, the gamble paid off. The match fundamentally altered the trajectory of Foley's career. 6 months later, the man Vince McMahon, once deemed unmarketable, was crowned a world champion. However, the bar had been permanently raised. Foley felt a crushing obligation to live up to the moniker of the hardcore legend. He continued to chase the roar of the crowd, taking risks that continually pushed the boundaries of human safety. Just 7 months after Hell in a Cell, Foley engaged in an I Quit match against Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. The bout devolved into a sickening display of unprotected head trauma. The original plan called for Foley to take 5 strikes to the head with a steel chair while handcuffed. In the heat of the moment, the script dissolved. Foley absorbed 11 unprotected shots to the skull. The collateral damage of that night was profound. His young children watched the brutal spectacle from the front row, traumatized by the sight of their father being beaten to a pulp. His daughter, Noelle, admits she holds no singular memory of her father ever wrestling, likely due to the intense psychological trauma of witnessing those events. The brain damage sustained for the sake of a television angle was, in the words of those closest to him, sickening. Part 7. The Echoes of the Fall. Today, the legacy of Mick Foley is a complex tapestry of triumph and tragedy. The physical bill for his 15 minutes in the spotlight has come due. Medical science now understands the devastating long-term effects of repetitive brain trauma, specifically chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. Foley has faced periods where he could not remember how to drive home. Independent neurologists have explicitly warned him of the severe consequences if he ever stepped into a ring again. He lives with the profound daily reality of his choices. He engages in mental gymnastics, performing spoken word shows to keep his mind sharp, continually seeking the stimulation and acceptance of a live audience. Colette encourages him to enjoy his life, but constantly reminds him not to push his luck. For years, Foley harbored deep resentment toward the Hell in a cell match. It cast a massive shadow over his entire career, reducing his multifaceted legacy to 2 terrifying falls. He felt he had accomplished nothing else. But a conversation with The Undertaker shifted his perspective. The dead man reminded him that what they created that night would outlive them both. In a poignant moment captured years later at a company warehouse, Foley came face to face with the original cell structure. Touching the cold, rusted steel, the legendary brawler broke down in tears. It was a profound realization of the danger, the fear, and the sheer luck that he was still alive to tell the tale. Mick Foley traded his body for the roar of the crowd. He transformed a deep-seated need for love and acceptance into a canvas for surreal, sublime, and highly dangerous performance art. There were moments of terrifying darkness, but there was also an undeniable magic in his ability to leave the world in complete awe. Was it worth the pain? Was it worth the trauma? Those are questions only Mick Foley can truly answer. But the evidence remains immortalized on film. A dangerously crazy masterpiece that continues to serve as both the ultimate testament to the human spirit and the darkest cautionary tale in the history of professional wrestling. Voiceover. For The Dark Side of the Ring, this is a story of a man who fell from the heavens, survived a descent into hell, and somehow walked away to tell us about the view. The Devil's Canvas. The Anatomy of Hell in a Cell. The Gateway to the Extreme. On June 28, 1998, the landscape of professional wrestling was forever altered inside the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. A structure of unforgiving steel descended upon the ring for the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring pay-per-view event. It was a match that would immediately earn its place as one of the most shocking, terrifying, and defining spectacles in the history of sports entertainment. The Undertaker versus Mankind. The match was Hell in a Cell. Hell in a Cell hits the consciousness like a heavy mallet. Viewers and industry insiders alike knew the concept was going to be inherently dangerous. But absolutely no one could have predicted the sheer magnitude of the chaos that was about to unfold. On that night, 2 unique talents stepped onto the grand stage. 2 men who had built their careers on pushing the envelope until it teetered precariously over the edge. Professional wrestling is often dismissed by critics as a stage performance. But as the events of that evening proved, you simply cannot fake gravity. Many veterans of the industry have confessed being frightened by various stunts over the years. But nothing instilled as much pure terror as this match. What left the fans in the locker room completely stunned was the unrelenting, incomprehensible punishment that Mick Foley, the man behind the Mankind mask, willingly endured until you witnessed it with your own eyes. You could not truly believe that a human being could physically absorb such trauma and survive. This match was vividly real. The pain was real. The drama was profoundly real. Backstage, peers and producers were cursing, screaming, and questioning the sanity of the man putting his life on the line. Why go to such extremes? Today, the legacy of this infamous Hell in a Cell match persists as both an epic success of storytelling and a dark cautionary tale about the human cost of entertainment. We dodged several bullets that day. The collateral damage that followed asked a chilling question. When is it enough? You pay all day long for the decisions you make during your 15 minutes in the spotlight. It was a dangerously crazy masterpiece, but as we look back, all of us need to ask ourselves a difficult question. Was it truly worth it? The psychology of a hardcore legend. To understand the madness of Hell in a Cell, one must first analyze the psychology of Mick Foley. Everyone who steps into a professional wrestling ring is searching for something missing in their own lives. For Mick Foley, a childhood marred by being constantly teased created an overwhelming, almost desperate need to be liked and accepted. He wanted the championship, but more importantly, he wanted the reaction of the crowd. According to Foley's own recollections, the genesis of his extreme style began during his sophomore year of college. In a desperate bid for attention, he took a swig of red food coloring and performed a high-flying leap off a bed, crashing onto a concrete floor. As he spat out the fake blood concoction, a female student screamed that it was the most disgusting thing she had ever seen. In that moment of revulsion, Mick Foley felt an undeniable surge of power. He realized that if he could not make people naturally love him, perhaps he could captivate them by disgusting them. He needed reactions, and he was willing to sacrifice his own body to get them. Mick Foley eventually became universally recognized as the hardcore legend. He survived Hell in a Cell, and that match is often cited as the perfect gateway for new fans. However, the sheer brutality of that bout sets a nearly impossible standard. A typical Mick Foley match was a grueling exhibition of hardcore violence, featuring blood, thumbtacks, fire, and barbed wire. He was a man who had been exploded by chemical explosives in Japan, speared through flaming tables, and slammed directly onto solid concrete. Those closest to him, including his daughter Noelle, acknowledged that he simply loved generating a visceral response from the audience. Realism was his primary tool. Foley genuinely believed he was not having a successful match unless he had physical trouble walking back to his hotel room. It was not that he enjoyed the pain itself. Rather, he found immense satisfaction in his ability to absorb it and sell the drama to the audience. His wife, Colette, who has known him for over 35 years, saw the duality of the man. She saw a gentle, kind person with terrible humor who chose Beauty and the Beast as their wedding song. Yet, she also understood his deep commitment to his craft. When the adrenaline pumped, his singular drive was to ensure the fans left talking about how great the show was, completely at his own risk. The journey to the World Wrestling Federation. Mick Foley's path to superstardom was anything but conventional. He developed an unpredictable persona known as Cactus Jack, a charismatic, seemingly insane brawler who commanded attention. Jim Cornette, an agent and producer for the World Wrestling Federation at the time, noted that Foley was a master of ring psychology. Foley understood that fans were inherently drawn to performers who appeared completely out of control, biting opponents, and seemingly going completely off the script. Before reaching the grand stages of American television, Foley honed his craft in Japan. Living humbly with a mattress on the floor and a broken television, he would study Japanese wrestling tapes for 12 hours a day. He was captivated by the realism and the storytelling where a wrestler had to defeat not just their opponent, but their harsh surroundings. In Japan, he found a mentor in Terry Funk, an absolute master at making audiences suspend their disbelief. Together, they engage in explosive, fiery death matches that established Foley's reputation. He thrived on the wild, visceral elements of combat, viewing the scars as proof that he had created something truly special. Despite this global success, Foley never envisioned himself in the World Wrestling Federation. The company was in a family-friendly era, presenting a polished, clean product that directly contradicted Foley's gritty style. Furthermore, the company's chairman, Vince McMahon, initially had absolutely no interest in hiring him. McMahon did not believe Foley was marketable or attractive enough for television. It was Jim Ross, the vice president of talent relations, who convinced McMahon to take a chance. Ross needed compelling opponents for The Undertaker, who was arguably the biggest star in the history of the industry. While McMahon favored matching The Undertaker with giant athletes, a formula Ross found increasingly. Though, Ross argued that what The Undertaker truly needed was a lunatic. McMahon finally relented, but with a strict condition. He would hire Foley, but they had completely covered his face. McMahon viewed Foley as a nobody, leading to the creation of the Mankind character. Gerald Briscoe, a legendary producer, recalled the monumental challenge of building a compelling persona out of deliberate obscurity. Yet, This bizarre concept succeeded solely because of Mick Foley's unmatched dedication. He committed his body and soul to character, forging a profound connection with the audience through sheer sacrifice. The conception of the cell. Mankind and The Undertaker built a legendary rivalry, battling across the globe in 7 pay-per-view matches and 10 television matches. However, Foley felt his character had reached a plateau. He desperately needed a catalyst to elevate his legacy rather than detract from it. As the King of the Ring event approached, producers planned to reignite the feud using a recently developed match concept. Traditional cage matches in the World Wrestling Federation require competitors to escape over the top or through a door. It was Foley who originally suggested putting a roof on the cage to ensure that both men would go in, but only one would walk out. Thus, Hell in a Cell was born. The inaugural Hell in a Cell match between Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker had been a masterclass in storytelling and athleticism, setting an incredibly high bar. Foley watched that first bout in awe, knowing he possessed none of the athletic agility of Shawn Michaels. 9 months later, burdened with the pressure of following a masterpiece, Foley consulted his mentor, Terry Funk. In a moment of dark humor, Funk jokingly suggested that they should start the match on top of the cell structure and that Foley should be thrown off. While Funk laughed, Foley fell completely silent. He looked at his mentor and realized that he could actually execute that horrifying idea. The concept took root in his mind and refused to let go. He pitched the idea to Vince McMahon and The Undertaker, portraying it as a casual, manageable stunt. The Undertaker was initially highly skeptical of throwing a man off a steel roof, but Foley's determination eventually won them over. Foley approached this match not as the dawn of a new era in his career, but simply as a desperate attempt to keep his head above water. He genuinely believed that when this particular run ended, his wrestling career would be over as well. The plunge from the heavens. When the Hell in a Cell structure lowered at the Pittsburgh Civic Arena, a sold-out crowd of 16,000 fans watched in anticipation. Jimmy Corderas, a referee and ring crew member, watched in the production area alongside Gerald Briscoe, fully aware that history was about to be written. As Mankind's music hit, he completely shattered expectations. Instead of entering the locked door, he immediately began scaling the outside of the massive steel structure. Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler, calling the action at ringside, were just as confused as the fans at home. Foley had confidently assured management that he was comfortable with heights, but in reality, as he reached the top, he was absolutely terrified. The lights glared, the arena stretched into darkness, and as The Undertaker's ominous music echoed, Foley silently wondered how he could climb back down without ruining his professional reputation. The match officially commenced 16 feet in the air. The danger escalated immediately. The roof of the cell was secured only by plastic zip ties, under the combined weight of nearly 600 pounds. The mesh flooring gave way with every single step. The sound of zip ties snapping echoed through the arena like gunfire. Foley attempted to execute a maneuver on the unstable steel, but The Undertaker wisely stopped him, recognizing the very real threat that the entire roof could collapse. They brawled toward the edge of the structure, directly above the commentary tables. Backstage personnel assumed they would tease the edge before moving back to the center. There was absolutely no margin for error. The tables below looked incredibly small from that towering vantage point. Then, the unthinkable happened. A 300-pound man was violently flung from the top of the cage, plummeting nearly 20 feet through the air. Time seemed to drastically slow down, yet it was over in the blink of an eye. The sickening crash of Mick Foley destroying the Spanish commentary table shook the very foundation of the arena. Backstage, the locker room erupted in absolute panic. It was completely synonymous with witnessing a fatal automobile accident. The collective thought among the performers and producers was chillingly unanimous. Mick Foley is dead. At ringside, announcer Hugo Savanovic narrowly escaped being crushed. The silence in the arena was deafening, followed by audible gasps of horror. Colette Foley, watching at home with their young children, desperately tried to soothe them by insisting it was fake, while our own mind spiraled into absolute terror. The physical reality of the fall was staggering. If The Undertaker had thrown him just an inch too far or too short, Foley would have violently impacted the exposed concrete floor. Miraculously, Foley possessed the spatial awareness to rotate his body in mid-air, landing flat on his back to maximize the cushion of the flimsy wooden table. Medical personnel, including Dr. Francois Petit, a martial arts expert and trusted medical professional for the locker room, rushed to the wreckage. Terry Funk was the first to reach Foley, frantically checking if his friend was still breathing. The situation was chaotic. The emergency gurney could not fit through the narrow ringside path, forcing officials to dramatically raise the enormous steel cell while The Undertaker remained standing on top of it. Foley was strapped to the stretcher. Everyone, from the fans to the executive producers, believed the match was unequivocally over, but Mick Foley was not finished. The unforgiving concrete. As Foley was being wheeled up the entrance aisle, he realized that the longer he remained on camera, the more captivated the audience became. Defying all medical logic and the desperate pleas from officials to stop, Foley climbed off the stretcher. Driven by adrenaline and a twisted sense of obligation, he began his ascent back up the cell. Backstage, respect morphed into total disbelief. How could a man survive such a fall and willfully return for more? But Foley was determined to complete the story. The next planned sequence was supposed to be relatively safe. A choke slam on the roof that would cause the steel mesh to gradually sag, creating a dramatic visual. Reality, however, is a cruel director. When The Undertaker lifted Foley and slammed him into chain link, the damaged zip ties completely surrendered. The roof violently tore open. Foley plummeted completely through the top of the cage, free falling to the solid ring mat below. This was not scripted. This was an absolute disaster. Backstage, the panic was immediate and absolute. The ring mat is essentially a thin layer of padding over tightly pulled canvas and rigid wooden boards. Hitting it from that height is exactly like crashing onto solid cement. To make matters even worse, a heavy steel folding chair, which had been resting on the roof, fell through the opening directly behind Foley, violently striking him in the face as he hit the mat. He lay entirely motionless. The concern was no longer about a wrestling match. It was about preserving a human life. Colette Foley watched in furious horror, feeling betrayed because she had not been warned about a second fall, completely unaware that neither had her husband. Foley was legitimately knocked unconscious. Officials flooded the cage once again. The Undertaker looked down from the broken roof at Terry Funk and commanded him to check if Foley was still alive. Funk relayed that he was still breathing. For 42 agonizing seconds, Mick Foley's mind went entirely blank, recognizing the desperate need to buy time. Terry Funk engaged in a spontaneous physical altercation with The Undertaker, diverting the attention of the audience and the cameras. In any standard athletic commission environment, the match would have been immediately stopped. But in that era of professional wrestling, matches were not stopped. Time was simply bought. When Foley finally regained consciousness, the first thing he saw was Terry Funk's shoes. The realization dawned on him that he was still in the middle of the match. Running entirely on instinct and adrenaline, he somehow managed to stand up. His face was a horrific, bloody mess. In a macabre display of showmanship, Foley realized he had a massive hole underneath his lower lip. He deliberately pushed his tongue through the wound to create a haunting visual for the television cameras. As he smiled, the world noticed a tooth lodged inside his nostril. Knocked out by the falling chair and inhaled through his nasal passage as he desperately gasped for air. The match continued into its final, agonizing act. Foley, still heavily concussed, signaled for the introduction of thumbtacks. He was slammed violently onto thousands of the sharp metal pins, purposely rolling around to ensure they stuck into his flesh. The adrenaline had completely overridden his central nervous system. He had become an active participant in his own pain. After 17 excruciating minutes, The Undertaker finally secured a victory. The 16,000 fans in attendance had witnessed an absolute spectacle of human endurance. When the medical team brought the stretcher out for a second time, Foley stubbornly waved it off, sparking a roar of appreciation that shook the rafters. He understood that risking his own physical well-being allowed the audience to deeply, truly believe in him. The aftermath and the I Quit match. Behind the curtain, Vince McMahon met Foley with a mixture of profound gratitude and absolute dread. While medical staff began the painful process of plucking thumbtacks from Foley's skin, McMahon thanked him for what he had done for the company, but strictly demanded that Foley promise never to do anything like it again. Foley was so disoriented that he had to ask The Undertaker if they had actually performed the thumbtack sequence. The physical toll was devastating. Foley suffered a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a bruised kidney that plagued him for 6 weeks, missing teeth, and required 15 stitches below his lip. The medical evaluation for a severe concussion was practically an afterthought in those days. Yet, from a professional standpoint, Hell in a Cell was a monumental triumph. It completely changed the industry perception of Mick Foley. Within 6 months, the man Vince McMahon once deemed unmarketable was crowned the World Wrestling Federation champion. However, the bar for violence had been set to an incredibly dangerous height. Foley felt immense pressure to consistently live up to the moniker of the hardcore legend. He felt he owed the fans an unprecedented spectacle every time he performed. Management warned him that continuing the style would ultimately catch up with him, but Foley pushed forward. Just 7 months later, Foley engaged in an infamous I Quit match against Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. This bout featured a stipulation where the match would not be stopped for excessive blood loss. Despite warnings from producers that it was a terrible idea, Foley structured the climax around taking unprotected chair shots to the head while his hands were handcuffed behind his back. He had originally instructed his opponent to hit him 5 times. In the chaos of the live performance, he absorbed 11 catastrophic blows to the skull. Colette Foley and their young children were present in the arena. The children were deeply traumatized, unable to distinguish between the scripted narrative and the very real brain damage their father was sustaining on national television. Noelle Foley later reflected on the sickening reality that a normal person could have easily died from absorbing 11 direct headshots with a steel chair. The echoes of the cell, the consequences of Foley's dedication, are profound and permanent. He understood that his chosen style would result in great discomfort, deliberately choosing to make maneuvers more painful if he believed it would look better for the audience. Doctors aggressively advised him to stop wrestling, warning him of crippling physical deterioration. But the allure of the performance kept drawing him back. Today, the long-term effect of multiple concussions cast a dark shadow over his legacy. Foley has experienced severe memory loss, sometimes driving around completely unable to remember where he lives. An independent urologist delivered a grim verdict. He should never step into a wrestling ring again. The fear of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a terrifying degenerative brain disease caused by repetitive trauma, looms heavily over his family. Every single bump taken in the ring is likened to experiencing a 25-mile-per-hour car crash, and Foley took thousands of them. Foley relies on spoken word shows and performing arts to exercise his mind, attempting to stay sharp as he ages. He chooses to appreciate what he accomplished rather than live in absolute fear of the unknown. For years, he harbored deep resentment toward Hell in a Cell, frustrated that his entire, multifaceted career was reduced to one singular, incredibly dangerous night. It was The Undertaker who helped him find peace, wisely noting that what they accomplished that night in Pittsburgh would outlive them both. Mick Foley offered the world a canvas of surreal, sublime performance art, painted with his own blood and sacrifice. When he recently visited the company warehouse and unexpectedly laid hands on the original Cell, the legendary tough guy broke down in tears. It was a profound realization of what he had survived. There is no monetary reward significant enough to truly cover the horrific risks he took. With modern medical knowledge regarding head trauma, one can only wonder if history would have been written differently. Yet, Mick Foley succeeded in his ultimate goal. He earned the thunderous roar of the crowd. He captured the undisputed awe of millions. He survived the Devil's Playground, cementing a legacy that will echo through the annals of sports entertainment until the end of time. The Shadow of the Cell, a legacy forged in steel. Introduction. The night reality broke through the canvas. On June 28, 1998, the professional wrestling landscape was forever altered. The event was the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring pay-per-view, held inside the packed Pittsburgh Civic Arena. That night, an audience of 16,000 people eagerly awaited a spectacle that would ultimately earn its place as one of the most shocking encounters in sports entertainment history. The Undertaker versus Mankind in Hell in a Cell. Hell in a Cell is a concept that hits you like a mallet to the consciousness. As an observer of this industry for decades, I knew the premise was going to be intense. But no one could have anticipated the sheer magnitude of what was about to unfold. We had two talents out there who liked to push the envelope until it tumbled over the edge. There is a common refrain among critics that professional wrestling is merely an illusion, but you cannot fake gravity. Throughout my career, I have been frightened by many things inside the squared circle, yet nothing frightened me quite as much as the events of that evening. What left fans absolutely stunned was the unrelenting physical toll Mick Foley endured. Until you saw it with your own eyes, you simply did not believe that a human being could physically sustain such impact and live to tell the tale. This match was real. The pain was real. The drama was real. For those of us watching, we were screaming, cursing, and questioning the very sanity of the performer. Why do this? Today, this infamous match persists as both an epic success and a stark cautionary tale. The collateral damage that ensued forces us to look deeply at the industry and ask, when does it stop? When is enough? As we pull back the curtain, we must examine the dangerously chaotic masterpiece that unfolded, and we all must ask ourselves the ultimate question. Was it worth the price? Part 1. The psychology of a hardcore legend. To understand the madness of Hell in a Cell, one must first understand the mind of Mick Foley. According to those who know the industry best, everyone who steps into a wrestling ring is looking for something they find missing in their own lives. For Foley, a childhood filled with being teased birthed an overwhelming, deeply rooted need to be liked and to capture the ultimate prize, the World Wrestling Federation Championship. As recounted by Foley himself, the blueprint for his extreme career began in his college years. He recalled a moment as a sophomore when he took a swig of red food coloring and executed a leaping dive off a bed, landing on a stuffed animal resting on a concrete floor. When he hit the ground and spit out the blood-like concoction, the dormitory crowd was watching. Hearing someone yell out in absolute disgust gave him a profound sense of power. It was a pivotal realization.